Okay, not that long ago, we discussed this whole concept of national divorce. And the first thing I want to say right off the bat is I don't want that. I don't want that. I love my country. I fought for my country. I want my country to stay completely intact. However, it is important to understand from a historical perspective. Sorry. Queen of the Bees had her volume on.
I thought I had it off.
We discussed this whole concept of national divorce and what were the conditions that would actually need to be there in order for such a thing to actually happen. We're not talking about like crazy theories, but like what are the conditions that are usually necessary for a country to undergo revolution? And so we're going to do a brief overview of those conditions that we discussed before, but then what we're going to talk about is the other thing that you notice historically is that certain conditions have to be met, and then there's a catalyst. There's something that takes place. There's that spark, and then there's a response. So we're going to talk today about the conditions. We're going to talk about the potential catalyst that could actually light this whole thing off. And then we're going to talk about the response of states, of the federal government, and of individuals. All of that and more coming up on this episode of Making the Argument, powered by Good Ranchers.
Thank you again for joining us. Today, during our live stream, we'll be using the Q&A feature within the YouTube live chat. So if you have a question that you would like to propose and have us answer, please go to the top of the live chat, click that button, and leave your question there. We look forward to seeing your comments in the regular live chat as we continue to stream today. But if you haven't already, go down to the link in the description. I hope you will join our community chat. We've been having some great conversations there with multiple people. It's been a pleasure getting to know everyone, and let's get right into today's show.
Okay, as always, I'm your host, Nick Freitas, member of the Virginia House of Delegates, but other than that, a reasonably good guy. Then we have my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Yes, sorry about the volume issue. I thought I turned it off.
I'll tell you what, had that been anybody else?
I caused the echo, everyone.
And then, of course, we have our resident historian and political prognosticator, who we are still searching for a more quippy nickname.
There's been a lot of options
Christian
so
of
far.
Doom.
Please provide potential suggestions. Christian, how are you doing?
Look, friend, I know that things seem scary right now, but I just want you to know it's about to get a lot worse. You know that meme, right?
And then, of course, we have our producer of producers, Nicholas Hamilton, the good Hamilton, the one that doesn't like central banking.
This is going to be awesome.
Oh, yeah. And actually, central banking will probably feature into a potential catalyst in here. All right, so first things first, let's go ahead and define our terms and make a few qualifying statements. So as I already said before, I love my country. I want my country to stay intact, but I also want to understand the sort of conditions that could take place in the United States. I don't want to be ignorant of history. I don't want to be ignorant of potential catalysts. So that's what we're going to discuss. So the three conditions that we discussed in a previous video where we talked about whether or not various things were in place to actually make like a genuine revolution within the United States, like genuine, conflict in the streets, potential separation, had those been met? And the conclusion we came to was no, but things were moving in that direction. So what were those three conditions? Well, the first one was when you have a significant significant sections of the population which fundamentally disagree about what the country is, what the purpose of its government is, what its core values are, certain unifying cultural points, right? And we came to the conclusion that it's been a long time since the United States has been probably this divided with respect to what we see as the potential within our country, whether or not our country and its founding is inherently good or bad, and the direction that we want our country to go. Do we want it to be focused more on this idea of kind of like the classical liberal notion? And by classical liberal, we're talking about things like, Montesquieu. We're talking things like John Locke. We're talking about these ideas of the founding where it was individual liberty and property rights and free market economics and a very, very limited, constrained government, especially at the federal level, right? That's more the classical liberal approach. The predominant left-wing approach has been far more focused on this idea of democracy as kind of the shaping characteristic of America, and therefore the majority essentially dictating what the values of the country would be. And those tend to be focused more on a collectivist future of America. That doesn't mean that everybody on the left is a communist or anything like that. It just means that when they see the role and the purpose of the government, they see one that is going to be playing a far more proactive role on what we might consider the culturally shaping and the economic shaping institutions within our country. This has to do with controlling education, controlling healthcare. What role should the government play with respect to managing the economy or making sure that there's a certain basic level of income? The left tends to prefer a far more active government and a far more active federal government in order to achieve their desired outcomes. Now, what you need to understand is that those two viewpoints are, on some level, diametrically opposed. They don't work. One side is basically saying we want the federal government to play a far greater role. That's going to require more coercion and confiscation and redistribution. And the other side is essentially saying, well, we don't want the federal government to play that role. So again, you're going to have some pretty significant conflict here where it's not agree to disagree. It's not live and let live. It's do what I want or else. So that was the first criteria. Like, do we have a general sense that we're all going in the same direction? We generally believe the same things. The second condition that we said was the geographical self-sorting. One of the things that we're starting to witness is that more and more people are starting to move, not just because of higher taxes, not just because the weather's nicer, not just because it might be a better regulatory environment for the business. That's part of it. But there does seem to be more of an ideological bent in why people are moving to different places right now. And that's significant because a lot of times throughout history, we've seen general trends, right? People say, oh, we got more people moving from New York to Florida. Okay, but if they're 65 plus, they're probably not moving because they have some sort of ideological problem with New York. They're probably leaving because it's warmer in Florida, right? You see the same thing with places like Arizona. But now we're starting to see a far larger shift of people packing up and leaving places like California, like Illinois, like New York, and they're going to decidedly more conservatively governed states. And for the first time, they appear to be going there and continuing to vote that way instead of going and changing into the place that they left. That's not to say that those things aren't still happening. Talk to anybody that lives in Austin or Colorado, and they will tell you that they are tired of people moving into their state and changing it from what they remembered it as. But we're starting to see a significant push with more geographical self-sorting based along ideological lines. And the reason why we discuss that being so important is because if you're actually talking about a situation where certain states decide they want to break away or they no longer want to be a part of this, you need to have an overwhelming portion of the population which actually believes that. Otherwise, it's very difficult. Now, we asked ourselves, has that condition been met? And the conclusion we came to is no, especially because there seems to be a big urban or rural divide, even within red states or blue states. But it seems to be moving in that direction. Again, so has the condition been met? No. But is it moving in that direction? It kind of seems to be. Here was the third criteria that we mentioned kind of broadly, and that was the federal imposition, right? The growth of the federal government to such a degree to where you can't escape the sort of policies that you can currently escape now within an individual state. So what is necessary for that? Well, what's necessary is for one side to not only have complete control of the federal government, and what we mean by that is they have control of both houses of Congress, they have control of the executive branch in the form of the presidency, and they have the ability to get what they want out of the Supreme Court. So you can imagine a scenario where if you had kind of a very left-wing progressive administration that was the Speaker, the Senate Majority Leader, the President, and let's say they, added 5 more justices to the Supreme Court, and now the Supreme Court was essentially a rubber stamp for those things. Now you can imagine an environment where they are now imposing things which are usually reserved at the state level. They're now imposing them on the federal level. Well, when that happens, you can't escape anymore. It's not like if you're a conservative that wants to leave California, you just go to Texas or Florida or Wyoming. It's not as if you're a liberal and you want to escape Texas or Florida and go to New York and California. At that point, whoever's controlling the federal government to that extent, they get to impose their will, right? And as we discussed many times, federalism is one of the things that allows the country to operate in such a way to where a republic can get to the size that we have in the United States and still respect cultural, economic, social differences among regions. But if everything's just imposed at the federal level, that becomes impossible. There's no more escape. So Have we reached that point yet? The answer is no. Obviously, we have split government right now. You'd say conservatives have more seats on the current Supreme Court. The Democrats control the Senate and the presidency, but the Republicans control the House. You'll have some people say that's just the uni party. All we're talking about right now is that nobody has the ability to ram home essentially anything that they want, like you see in certain places that have parliamentarian democracies. All right, so those are the three conditions. All right, those are the things that we discussed. Again, one of those we said has been met. One of those has been met. That's the diametrically opposed ideas. That's the idea where we're no longer arguing about just what should the top marginal tax rate should be. We're now arguing about who we are as a country and where we should be going in a very, very significant and fundamental way. That's been met. Second one, geographical self-sorting. Not totally been met, but starting to be met. And then the third one is one side controlling the federal government and believing that the federal government is the proper tool to implement their will. That already exists on the left, but it's starting to exist more on the right now, right? That's always been something that hasn't really characterized the right, but it's starting to more and more in the United States. So one has been met. One seems to be going in that direction. One has not been met. What we're going to talk about today is, assuming those three things were met, what would be the catalyst? What would be the tipping point? Because what we find throughout history, when we look at World War II, when we look at World War I, when we look at different crisis points within the French Revolution, when we look at our own revolution within the United States, there's usually a whole set of things that lead up to something, but then there's a tipping point. There's something that we can all point back to, where it was the storming of the Bastille for the French Revolution, even though so many things had happened before the storming of the Bastille. But that seems to be a kickoff point that is significant within the history of the French Revolution. Whether it's the assassination of Franz Ferdinand that kicked off World War I, that would not have been a big deal had there not been several other conditions that ended up being the powder keg, that ended up being the match that lit it all. So that's what we're going to discuss today. What are the potential catalysts that could take place that could really kick this whole thing off? And the thing that you need to know when you talk about these conditions and when you talk about a catalyst is the catalyst can be something very, very simple. For instance, it could be you going to the store and realizing that there's no steak, there's no chicken, and there's no seafood. And that is your catalyst to then go to Good Ranchers. That is your catalyst. Quiet, all of you. That is your catalyst to then go to Good Ranchers, because Good Ranchers is not going to let you down. Good Ranchers is not going to be a catalyst for violent revolution, because they are dependable and because they raise quality American beef, poultry, pork. If you want to make sure that you are operating with a company, right, that shares those basic core values, but is absolutely dedicated to creating a quality product, Good Ranchers is the place to go. We actually had Ben Spell on here, and one of the things I talked to him about was like, look, I cannot stand so-called conservative businesses demanding my patronage because they claim to be patriotic. You want to put the American flag on your symbol. You want to talk about you're the sort of company that shares my values. Well, then that should translate into a quality product and service. And Ben Spell and the people at Good Ranchers and the ranches they deal with absolutely believe that. And I know, because we have ordered their food repeatedly and we have never been disappointed. Plus, today, because we're also fiscally conservative, you order Good Ranchers and you go to the link and you use promo code Nick. It's right there in the channel. You can see it right there. Use the promo code Nick. You're going to get $30 off and free shipping for some of the best, most quality American-raised beef, pork, poultry, seafood you've ever had. Go over to Good Ranchers, promo code Nick, to get that $30 off and free shipping from a company you can trust. All right. Now, let's go ahead and talk real quickly.
The perfect ad segue doesn't exist. Nope, prove me wrong. Actually, last episode, there was somebody in the comments that said that when you said that. So you're doing a better job with that.
I don't know. Somebody said this was the most amazingly awful sponsor segue I've ever seen. Like the worst you've ever seen?
No,
not the worst.
Way worse ones.
I could do worse.
So,
I'll practice. I could do worse. I thought that was pretty.
The whole catalyst thing is interesting, because there's a distinction. We were talking about this right before the episode began. There's a distinction between events that contribute to something happening and the spark that actually, starts the fire, right? One is the gasoline and the other one is the match.
Yeah.
A really good example that I think you listed is, actually, it's kind of related to my paper, right? Like, because you can look at like decades, like going back to like the Franco-Prussian War, right? You can go back like 40 years before World War I and find things that contributed to the causes of the war. But none of those things started the war. It was one man's assassination that actually, sent troops across the border, in Belgium, right? The meme, when you're an Englishman and you're drafted to go fight the Germans in France because a Serbian shot an Austrian in Bosnia, like nobody could have necessarily really predicted that ahead of time.
Well, you were recently reading a book, and it was one that I don't know if they recommended. Like another channel that we love to watch is What If Alt Hist. I mean, if you haven't seen that channel, go check it out. They're really good. But this book on what's the title of it?
It's called I'll bring it up so that way the audience can look at it. It's called The Anatomy of Revolution by Crane Brinton. The book was originally published in, I think, 1938. Might have been 1937. I'm pretty sure 1938. It was revised in either the 50s or 60s. But this book, it's a really good book, by the way. Brinton actually ended up being a huge influence for Carroll Quigley, who's a historian that What If Alt Hist actually really likes. And he ended up writing some forewords to a few books by Quigley. Well, this book lays out a kind of a guide for the course in which a revolution typically takes place. Now, he points out that not all revolutions are the same, right? But he brings up some key unifying points between 4 major revolutions that took place going back to the English Revolution in 1860, or I think 1860s. Might have been 1850s. No, sorry, 16. Why do I keep saying 18? 1640s. And he goes through the English Revolution, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and finally the Russian Revolution. And he points out that there's a few things that unite all of them. And then there's also a couple things that are separate. Like, for example, the American Revolution does not have a reign of terror, whereas the other 3 do. But what's interesting is the catalysts that he brings up. There's some unifying things that contribute to a revolution happening. Now, sometimes they take different courses, but one of the things that he brings up is actually a topic that I think we're going to go into more detail in this episode about, which is the economic side. But I want to hold off on that because we've got that. That's going to be popping up later on in the episode. But there's a couple things in here. I might end up actually quoting from it later in the episode when we actually get to the economic stuff. But yeah, it's definitely a book worth taking a look at in case you haven't actually read it.
And they do come to the conclusion that economics is a key component of a key catalyst or condition that needs to be met, and that kind of makes sense, right? Because the economics is something that affects all of us. I mean, you can talk all day long about various political sentiments. If once you get to the point where you can't feed your family. Now, I will say this, it's been interesting to note that most of your vanguard revolutionaries are not super poor people. Because again, they're on the verge of like just basic subsistence, if not subsistence itself, right? It's subsistence or starvation. You don't have a lot of extra time to sit around coffee shops writing your manifestos when that's the case, right?
This is why there's no revolution in North Korea.
Yeah. It's usually middle class or maybe the bored elite or whatever it is that participates in this. But we talked about a couple ones that we wanted to throw out here, and this is another one too for the audience. If you guys think that there's potential catalysts or whatnot that could and by a catalyst, again, we don't mean something that just causes, general frustration or anger or a lot of, tweets or X's or whatever they're called now, right? It's not that. We're talking about something. We're talking about a very, very significant, organized response. So here's a couple of the ones that we just wanted to throw out there that we thought would be interesting for conversation. Now, I'm gonna bring up something. George Floyd. So if you actually look at the whole history of George Floyd, what you actually find is someone that had been violent, unstable. He had actually, I think, held a gun to a pregnant woman at one point as they were robbing her or threatening her or something like that. He had a long rap sheet. He had all of these things going that you would look at and say, okay, this obviously was not a good dude. Now, does that mean that the police handled that situation the way that they should have? No, not necessarily. Two things can be true at once, right? George Floyd can be a bad dude, and the police still could have responded to it in a way that wasn't appropriate.
I don't know, honey. Did you see the Candace Owens interview with his roommates that she did where she said, "This is the Bible we were reading that, just earlier that day, and we were all praying together, and we were talking about the Bible." Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do. But
Yeah.
I also saw the rest of that where Candace Owens went on to expose a lot of things that BLM had did and what had happened with that. Now, again, here's my point here. The point here is not to say that the police did it all right. The point here is not to say that George Floyd, should have died in that exchange. That's not any of it. The point is that I remember hearing, I think it was Joe Biden saying that even more than Martin Luther King, George Floyd exposed us to the. Are you
What
out
a
of your
slap in the face?
Are you out of your mind? But the point is that George Floyd, a guy that didn't deserve to be anywhere near in the categorization of Martin Luther King or other civil rights leaders, all of a sudden was a catalyst, not for a total revolution, but it was a catalyst for a lot of activism, which actually produced not only protests, but in many respects, violent riots.
I
Right?
wonder if this guy
Mostly
that was
peaceful
like
protests.
completely spun out of his mind high half of his adult life would be shocked to find out there were statues of him now.
Yeah. So the point that we need to look at is like that's an example of something that didn't lead to a revolution, but it did lead to a lot of conditions like you saw in Seattle and Portland, where you actually had people taking over portions of a municipality, not permitting the police to enter, and actually having a lot of mayors like quasi supportive of it, until all of a sudden people started getting murdered inside those areas. So this is what we're talking about. Like we're talking about that. So here's my first question, and we'll open this up to the audience and everyone here. What happens? We've got several indictments against Trump right now at the federal level, at the I think at the state level, potentially municipal level. Don't quote me on that, but several indictments, federal, state level. What happens if Trump not only gets convicted? We're not talking about convicted and has to pay a fine, or maybe he's a felon and whatever, but actually gets thrown in jail at the same time that Hunter Biden, Joe Biden completely get off. Hunter Biden gets a sweetheart deal. What happens at that point? Is that enough of a catalyst to where you would actually see significant portions of the population basically saying, forget it, I'm done. I don't recognize the authority of these institutions or organizations or agencies anymore. Like I'm done. Christian.
Oh, you're starting with me.
I'm starting with you.
No, I don't think that's gonna kick everything off. I think that will lead to some brief political chaos, some potentially violence, right? We saw that with George Floyd, but George Floyd's death did not start a revolution.
Yeah,
it started a summer of people burning down cities and looting stores and business fronts and beating people in the streets.
Yeah, that was the worst manifestation of it.
But it did not create a revolution. It did not fracture the country. It did not lead to civil war or anything like that. Right. There was no national divorce that took place because of the George Floyd riots, because of the BLM stuff. So I personally, I mean, it's probably really unpopular to say that with Republicans or conservatives, but whatever. I mean, I'm just sharing.
So you think if they haul Trump out in handcuffs in an orange jumpsuit,
you'll get a lot of protests. You might get some violence potentially from elements of the right, but I do not think that Trump's indictment. I mean, he has 4 indictments, right, or potentially 4. He's got 3 right now. 4th one seems like it's coming soon. I don't think that those, even if he gets convicted on any of them, even if he gets sent to prison on any of them, I don't think that's going to trigger a national divorce. I do think that it would trigger a lot of protests, but I don't think that is sufficient to be. That is not a Franz Ferdinand moment, believe it or not. Even though that sounds very similar, it's not a Pearl Harbor moment or the German tanks rolling into Danzig. It's just. That would lead to a lot of protests, but that I don't think is sufficient to.
Do you
create
think
a
it would
national
just
divorce.
be protests though? Like, do you think it would just be protests?
I think it could be worse than that.
I think it would be. I think it would be significant.
I don't know.
All right, Tina, what do you think?
Okay, so I tend to think that the type of people that would be the most upset about something like this also have jobs to do and families to feed, and so they would get very, very angry, as they have gotten in the past over things. They'll probably question, when do we do this? When do we go fight? Like, when does this start? They'll probably question that stuff. They will probably look to people like you at their state legislature level and rattle your cage and talk to you about how you're not doing enough and how you're doing like, why aren't you protecting us? Why aren't you doing something? And so I think a lot of folks would rattle the cages of those in political power that are on their side of the aisle and be like, why aren't you doing enough? But I'm not positive they themselves will go and do things because they have families to feed and things like that. So there might be like a small element. You guys are having like this
No, go ahead.
visible argument over here. Okay. There might be like a small element of people that do something physical, that do go do something, but I think it'll be squashed pretty quickly. I think that the January 6th stuff, for the most part, I think has served its purpose. The purpose being that if you do something, we will go out after you relentlessly and ruin your life, and we'll lie about you in the media and things like that. And so basically what it's meant to be is a deterrent from people who rise up and have a problem with the government ever again. And so they want to kind of bring the smack down on them. So I think a lot of people will have been adequately deterred from any action they might have taken. Some people may take action, and then others will just yell at you for not taking enough action.
All right. So no, and look, I think this is one that actually.
Do you disagree with that?
I think that you would have a lot of people that would fall within the category that you just described. I think there would be a lot of people that they would rise up and they would go to a protest and they would call my office as a state legislature.
Inevitably, about 80% of the people won't do anything but scream and yell at you.
I will say this, though. When you have 20% of the people that are willing to do some pretty significant things, I mean, if you look at what was happening in Massachusetts at the beginning of the American Revolution, the Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty was not the overwhelming majority of the population, but they were well organized and they were actually very strategic in the things that they hit. Most people don't realize that the Boston Tea Party, people think that this was, something of a mob. This was an incredibly well organized, executed strategy. In fact, did you realize that, and Christian, counter me if I'm wrong on this, but I'm almost positive that when they went and they threw the tea off of the boat, there was a couple things that we're very careful about. One, they only damaged property associated with the East India Trading Company, which was a state-sponsored industry of the Crown. They actually had to break private locks in order to get to it, and they actually replaced the lock. They actually replaced the locks because they were very, very strategic and targeted on what they were going after. If it wasn't actually a symbol of the government, because the East India Trading Company wasn't private property in the same sense that like you own things. So essentially they gave themselves a lot of moral clarity with respect to what they were going after. Now, I don't know that there's any organization that would be able to do that, but I do believe that if they do the perp walk with Donald Trump, they're going to have to be, especially depending on what prison they put him. If it's a federal prison, I'm telling you right now, that's just going to be.
I just don't think that's going to happen.
That's going to be a nightmare. That's going to be an absolute. I think the left absolutely wants it. I think they want to see a perp walk. I don't think they're going to be happy with
I think they
fines.
want to see that purely not just because they want to see Trump walk, but they want to see our side go ballistic so that they can point at him and be like, see what you are.
Maybe so, but can I say this? When January 6th first kicked off and we're all watching these things happen, we're all watching. I mean, I was furious. I was furious because as frustrated as I was with everything that was going on that year. And by the way, my name had been on the ballot that year too. Like I had been ahead on election night.
Yeah.
And then
they found a thumb drive with 16,000 votes in it.
Well, I don't think it was 16,000, but it was like 15, I thought. Nope. But anyway, the point was that there were things that happened that regardless of whether or not it had been illegal, there was things that happened that you would look at and be like, that's shady, that's ridiculous, it shouldn't have happened that way. It was frustrating, the whole deal. So like I understood the frustration of what was going on, not only on like kind of a national level, but I understood it at a very, very personal level. And I was still furious with this idea that people were going to break into the Capitol and that they were going to threaten violence against anybody that didn't do what they wanted. But here's the other thing that we ended up learning much later, and as soon as Republicans took control and Tucker Carlson got a hold of this stuff, is that there were a lot of people engaging in horrible, violent, you could even posit insurrectionist behavior. But there was a lot of other people that had been invited into the Capitol and weren't doing anything wrong. They weren't threatening members of Congress. They weren't doing any of that stuff. And there was a lot of people that fell into one category that got treated like they were in another category. And I think a lot of people, once full videos came out and testimony and they started hearing about what was going on, and once again, it was this idea that once again, we've been lied to about what actually happened by members of the press that had an agenda. And none of what I just said takes away from what I believe to be the horrible actions of people that did engage in vandalism and violence and everything else. But to caricature anybody that was there at that point as if they were all a part of this nefarious attempt to overthrow the country, it is verifiably false. And so to your point where, okay, they do the perp walk, Trump is locked up, he's put in federal prison. Yeah, I could definitely see people showing up to that federal prison and being very, very upset about it. And I don't know what would happen at that point.
I can tell you what would happen. You would have people on the inside shooting through the door and killing people on the other side, like they did during January 6th. I mean, the one person that got killed during that, who was actually killed, there was somebody that had a medical emergency, and that's different. And then you have somebody that actually was shot through the door.
Through a window, I think.
Or through a window, whatever. She was shot by somebody from the inside shooting outward. They didn't even know what they were shooting at that point. They didn't even know if there were people with guns on the other side of it. So yeah, I think people are going to they're going to think twice before kind of storming a door like that. But can I just point out that if you're going to have a grievance with your government and systemic problems with your government, the government is the one to show the grievance to. Mm-hmm. The Capitol's the one to go and show your grievance to. Not some random person down the road's business that you set on fire and start throwing things through windows. And so I feel like there's a real difference between the way the left protests and the way the right protests. The right protests, it's government doing things it shouldn't do most of the time. And the left protests the government by burning down their neighbor's store.
All right, let's look at the second one. So I don't think anybody here thinks that Trump being jailed would actually be enough to kick everything off. But I will say this: I think it could have a far more significant effect and impact than I think you guys do.
It'll be a cause, not a catalyst.
Okay.
So, to use the analogy,
yeah.
The competing alliance structures that emerged in Europe in the late 19th, early 20th century, that's a cause. The Anglo-German naval arms race, that's a cause. Like the German response to the Boer War, that's a cause. Like these are all things that contribute to the Balkan Wars, the two Balkan Wars before World War I, the Italo-Turkish War. Like these are all causes of World War I, but none of them were a catalyst. Mm-hmm. Collectively, though, and there's so many other ones, like the Moroccan crisis. I could just keep going. There's so many examples. If you study like pre-World War I diplomacy, you can find like 50 causes. No single one of those causes, again, sent German troops across the border in Belgium. But collectively, all of them taken together, serious historians of the First World War, if I were to write a book about it, and I was to write a book about the lead up to it, I would have multiple chapters about each of these different events because they all played a huge role in creating the conditions that led to July 1914. But none of them, again, actually triggered the fighting itself. So to use the Trump example, it's not that Trump's indictment or potential imprisonment or conviction is irrelevant, right? It's not that it's something that is just going to be, worthy of being totally ignored. But I don't think that that's going to be the spark that leads to a national divorce or a civil war or a revolution or any combination of those.
I think there are elements that would like that to be. I think it'll be like that meme where it's the guy that's got the stick and he's like, "Come on, do something,"
I think what it would do for a significant portion of there's already, I would say, a significant portion of the population which has a mistrust of federal law enforcement. That already exists. I think if you found a situation where it was the feds, right? It was the federal government that indicted and imprisoned Trump at the same time that Hunter Biden got a sweetheart deal. I think what you would see is a significant portion of the population that moves from this idea that the problems within these federal institutions are just the leadership. And I think you would actually see a lot more generalized animosity and complete mistrust, to where you would have a significant portion of the population that would believe in just actively, at the very least, complete non-cooperation. And I think what it would cause them to do, this goes to your point, Tina, like what would they do at the state level? I think you would see far more pressure at the state level and on state legislators to pass legislation basically saying local and state law enforcement are no longer permitted to join joint task force with the federal government. They're no longer permitted because right now those things are optional.
Well, what are the chances they say basically the federal government is not allowed to send their law enforcement here, and our law enforcement will arrest your law enforcement? When does it get to that point?
That's a different point. So that's what we call interposition. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But I do think you would see in certain states where more and more state legislators would actually start to drop bills which would say local and state law enforcement are no longer engaged in joint task force with the federal government. Now, the area where that's probably most common is counter narcotics, right? It's counter drug and things of that nature. You can make an argument too that it would be assistance with immigration policy. But again, if your state government has absolutely no confidence that the federal government is actually going to enforce immigration policy, and really all that they're using these joint task force for are to go after, people within their state or narcotics, you could actually see I could see an argument being made within state legislators of people saying, nope, we don't want the connection anymore. If the feds want to do it, the feds can do it, but we're not allowing our state law enforcement to assist. Now, I will tell you this, that would be incredibly difficult to get through any state legislature, but I could definitely see more organizations calling for it, because one of the things we've discussed before is the federal government does not have the law enforcement capacity to actually enforce all of these federal laws and regulation. They oftentimes depend on local law enforcement or state law enforcement to assist them in that process, because ostensibly there's a benefit to the state to get people that are violating federal law, in jail. And so the state and local law enforcement helps. But if you actually create a crisis where a significant portion of the population does not trust federal law enforcement, then I think you would see a greater push. And to Christian's point, I don't think it's a catalyst in and of itself. But if you're starting to lay conditions down where now states are not being cooperative with federal law enforcement, you're inviting situations where the next step is not only are we not going to cooperate, but we're not going to have you impose that federal law within our jurisdiction. And that's called interposition. It's happened before in this country. It's happened before for reasons that I think all of us at this table would agree with. We've talked about this before. Law enforcement in Wisconsin jailed a federal marshal because he was trying to return a runaway slave to captivity, and Wisconsin didn't recognize the validity of the Runaway Slave Act. So it has happened before. It could happen again. I could see this sort of thing being a catalyst, but I tend to agree that I don't think it's enough in and of itself. All right, let's talk about another one. Let's talk about the second point here. And if you guys have any questions on here, please put questions sorry. Do what Hamilton says. Put the questions up and we'll ask.
Yeah, there's a Q&A link now. All
right, so let's go ahead and look at we'll take a couple questions before we move on to the second potential catalyst. So Catachrome asks, question, is there still a reason to believe that state authority trumps federal when federal appears to overreach on state authority continuously now? Catacomb, beautiful question. Absolutely wonderful question. And I think this is something Christian's going to hit on a little bit later when we get into some of the financial stuff. I think so. And the reason why I say that is because there's still a legal structure in place. The number one thing that has allowed the federal government to kind of trump state authority has not been the federal government just arbitrarily passing laws or regulations, although I would argue they do that. It's mainly become a funding mechanism. So because the federal government confiscates so much of our money through federal income tax and through capital gains and through estate taxes and through everything else, the federal government can now say, we want you to do this, or we want you to comply with this, or we want you to work on this, or you won't get the benefit of the federal funding associated with the program. So the 16th Amendment of the Constitution has essentially allowed the federal government to be able to extort the states and maybe not coerce, but in some way, let's say, heavily incentivized through an extortionist, method, which you could argue is coercion, that if you don't comply with what we want, then we're gonna take this money away and you won't get any. And I can tell you right now, there's a tremendous amount of pressure on legislators at the state level to go along with these things so that we can get the federal money. Oftentimes we'll be accused of leaving all of these dollars on the table or not wanting our constituents to get their money back if we don't comply with federal rules, regulations, or programs. And I will tell you right now from personal experience, when guys like me stand up and say, I'm sorry, but we are giving into extortion and this is not right, you will get a lot of pushback. So I do think the federal government has usurped a lot of what would have been considered traditional authorities or kind of what you might call, respective lanes between the states and the federal government through federal funding. But I think there's still a lot of area for that to go. And the real question is how are the states going to push back against the federal government without potentially losing a lot of funding, especially for transportation, for education, for healthcare that they currently heavily depend upon? And that would actually take a very, very different path. So if you saw a state basically saying that we will no longer require individuals or businesses within our jurisdiction to send money directly to the federal government, they will send it to the state, and then the state will send its share.
You mean how it should be?
That would be a case where all of a sudden states would be less dependent on the federal funding as a result of that, and it would give a lot more power. But your point is well taken that right now they've really trumped that, no pun intended. Daffy Duck question: doesn't the Constitution allow us to create a new government when the government no longer functions to protect the people? So
this is a bit of a misnomer. I think he's referencing Article 5. Potentially, that's probably what he's referencing. I've heard a lot of people bring up this belief that the Constitution has some clause written into it about how we can change or overthrow the government. There's nothing in there about overthrowing the government. There's a mechanism in there, the Article 5 Convention of States, that allows for constitutional amendments to be adopted through the state legislatures directly rather than going through the traditional process that we've done with every single amendment so far, which is it goes through Congress and then it's submitted to the state legislatures for their approval or rejection. That's how every amendment's been passed, but there is a second mechanism that we've never used before, and part of the reason we've never used it is because people don't really know how it would work. Conservatives are actually very heavily divided on Article 5. You talk to one, and they'll be like, oh, it's the greatest idea to rein in the federal government ever. And then you talk to another group of people, and they will think that it's a backdoor for us to become South Africa or Venezuela.
Yeah.
So honestly, it's probably never going to happen. Like, I feel like that you would rather, we would be more like, if we ever got to a point where an Article 5 actually could happen, we're probably already at a point where we would just have another constitutional convention outright.
Yeah.
Like, right? Another Philadelphia.
I mean, to his point, yes, to Daffy's point, the Constitution obviously allows for itself to be amended, and theoretically it can be amended in any way that you can get a vast majority of the American population through its state legislatures and the federal government to essentially concede to. The thing is that's obviously very, very difficult to achieve. Now, the other thing that you may be referring to is what Jefferson talked about in the Declaration of Independence, is that essentially when a people, essentially has to throw off the bonds it has with its current nation in order to go a different path, that they, first of all, that they should actually appeal to the general population and provide the reasons, but they do have an inherent right to be able to do so. And so there is that component both from a philosophical standpoint, and then as with Article 5, there's a legal component for how the Constitution could be altered. But that's it. Let's go to this other one here, and then we're going to get on to the second catalyst. If the issue is federal extortion, why not pull all tax rights back to the state and have the Fed deal directly with the states for funding instead of a population tax? Brother, you're speaking my language. I think it's actually a good idea. Originally, when you look at federal taxing authority before the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, which, by the way, didn't come across as 1919, I think was the 16th Amendment was ratified.
16th Amendment is 1913.
13, thank you.
It's pre-World War I.
Thank you. Yeah, and World War I was in large part the justification for it. But if you're going to do that, again, it would be fairly difficult because the 16th Amendment of the Constitution does give the federal authority the constitutional authorization to tax people directly. We did an episode once on parts of the Constitution you shouldn't like, and one of the things we talked about was a repeal of the 16th Amendment. Now, the federal government still had mechanisms to fund itself, but it was largely through things like tariffs and excise taxes. So it had to do more with foreign trade than it had with direct taxes to individuals within the United States. All right, let's move on to the second potential catalyst. This would be a complete left-wing control of the federal government. Now, we've already said that's a potential condition, right? But the catalyst would be court packing. So let's say you get Elizabeth Warren as the Senate Majority Leader, Gavin Newsom as President of the United States. I don't know, pick your speaker, Hakeem Jeffries is Speaker of the House.
AOC. Let's make it AOC.
And they let's not, oh my gosh, let's not go total communist clown world yet. But they decide that, because Elizabeth Warren has already said this, there's been significant people within the House of Representatives that have said this. They basically come to the conclusion that we have to expand the membership of the Supreme Court. And so they add, 4 positions. And lo and behold, all 4 positions are extreme, woke, progressive members of the Supreme Court. Now, here's the question. We're going to start with Tina this time. They get complete control of the federal government, which we've already said is a condition. The catalyst is they actually go in, they pack the court, they add 4 new positions, and they are all like woke progressive justices. Like we just get a bunch more Sotomayor's.
I feel like that would be an adequate catalyst. I think that would be, you'd get a lot of people on the right. You'd even get people on the left that were more true to what the democratic principles used to be. The people that were still kind of hanging on to the left. I think you would get a big section of the independents as well. They would start really realizing something is completely wrong here. Although I do think that the media has lost a lot of its power, and so maybe people wouldn't just march along and do whatever the media says, but in the past that's kind of been the case. They will spin the narrative however they have to keep the people happy with whatever's going on on the left. And so it really depends. Like if the media has lost its stranglehold, as I think it kind of has, I think that would be a catalyst that would cause people to do something. However, it would really require some type of leadership to get behind, because everybody wants to do something, but no one knows quite what to do at this point. And so then they'll be looking to people and going, who's going to lead us to get out of this mess? And so I think that would start with some kind of a leader, like finding a leader. I think that would then spur on a catalyst of that leader getting.
Okay, so Tina says court packing could be a sufficient catalyst to really tip things off. And again, tip things off doesn't mean that Florida declares war against the federal government. Tip things off just means it's like, yep, that's the rallying cry that everyone uses. So Tina says yes, that's a sufficient catalyst. Christian?
I think that it would be yes if the circumstances in which court packing took place were through an election where the overwhelming majority of the public is actually heavily divided on who won. So I brought this up before we started recording. Imagine in 2020, you can be on whatever position that you want.
Yeah.
But when you look at the official tallies, even if you think those official tallies are illegitimate,
yeah,
you can look at the official tallies of the vote, totals in Pennsylvania and in Arizona,
Georgia.
Wisconsin, and Georgia, right? The states that basically decided the election. You can also throw Michigan in there if you want. Even if you think it's illegitimate, the fact is that the margin of victory in those states was sufficient that, again, if you don't agree, you still know people who do agree.
Yeah.
Right? You know people on the right who do agree. I know people, my parents are still utterly convinced that the election was rigged.
Yeah.
But they know that there's other people on the right that don't agree with that.
Yeah.
Now imagine if 2020 had been decided by the same margin as 2000. Imagine if we had a 2000 situation in Pennsylvania where the election had come down to 500 votes in Pennsylvania.
Hanging chads?
Instead of 100,000 votes in Pennsylvania. It's a lot harder to manufacture hundreds of thousands fraudulent ballots. Again, even if you think that it was stolen, the fact is that the margin was large enough that there's enough people on the right that were convinced it wasn't.
Yeah,
right?
there's
People
still
like
a
Mike
segment
Pence.
Well, just like there was in 2000, I remember 2000 vividly. There was enough people on the left that were not convinced that it was stolen. There's some that thought it was, but there was not enough to convince it was stolen to actually cause some.
We
sort
weren't
of
as
major issue.
polarized though today.
No, but that's the point, right?
Like I watched a few months ago. I watched the concession speech from Al Gore. That he gave in December 2000.
Yeah.
And say whatever you want about Al Gore. I obviously vehemently disagree with his politics. I never would have voted for him. But if you actually watch that concession speech, and yes, it came after he filed all these lawsuits and took it all the way to the Supreme Court. But if you watch the concession speech, it's very gracious. It's very unifying. He says over and over again that, you know, we all need to rally behind George Bush. You know, we're one country. It's a very, it's actually,
it's conciliatory.
It's a very conciliatory. Yes, he was a sore loser up until that point, but he actually was, he went down pretty honorably at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody ever would have given that speech today.
No.
In either party. I seriously encourage everybody to go and watch Al Gore's concession speech in December 2000 when they're done watching the show, and then ask yourself, would any politician in today's political environment ever say the type of stuff that he said in that speech? And that's what I mean by this.
Well, but the thing is there's a much bigger divide now, like you were saying. Much bigger divide. Back then, you could be almost correct in saying that all these politicians are the same. There's not much difference between them. And the differences you could find would be a little more slight, you know. I mean, there's certain things that have always divided us, like the abortion issue and things like that. But other than the abortion issue, a lot of the fiscal stuff would be very slight. A lot of your even stuff with the Constitution would be more slight or less magnified. And so I think now we are really diametrically opposed in many areas.
You know what they say?
So many more areas of life than we used to be.
Republicans are Democrats from 20 years ago.
But we're not.
Here's what I'll tell you. I don't think there's any question. I don't think there's any question that conditions are very, very different now than they were in 2000. I think the point that Christian's making, and I tend to agree with this, is we're talking about court packing as a potential catalyst. That's the topic. Mm-hmm. Tina's saying that yes, that is a sufficient catalyst to engender a response, and we're going to talk about some of the potential responses to some of these. You're saying that you believe that the court packing is a sufficient catalyst if it happens as a result of a highly, highly contested election cycle.
It needs to look extremely illegitimate. And don't get me wrong, court packing is illegitimate in and of itself.
Yeah.
But imagine a scenario where the Democrats win an election in a landslide, like a Obama type, 2008 landslide. Let alone, any of the landslides that took place before that, like FDR or something like that.
Yeah.
Imagine that they win in another 2008 landslide by like 7 or 8 points, and then they have huge majorities in Congress, and then they pass it. Yes, would a lot of people be upset? People like us at the table would be very upset. A lot of people might get politically active because of it. But it would be really hard to argue that it's illegitimate. I would still argue the action is illegitimate, but it would be really hard for me to convince my fellow countrymen that they stole this, they rammed this through, and now they've shredded the Republican Constitution and just guaranteed their iron grip support over our government, and now they're going to impose our will on us, because it's going to be like, well, the public voted for this.
Okay, well if
it's a 2000 scenario.
Yeah.
And it's decided by 500 votes in Pennsylvania. And it's like, no, in this environment, every single Republican is utterly convinced that, no, this is stolen. Because I'll be honest, if it's 500 votes in Pennsylvania, you can find 500 votes in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
And so, I was...
You can find 500 votes at like 2 precincts.
Yeah, I was not really on board with all of the election lawsuit stuff in 2020 because I'm an election nerd, and I did the math, and I was like, I find it very difficult for you to manufacture hundreds of thousands of votes across 4 states. But manufacturing hundreds of votes in one state... and that determines everything. And then the party that wins that then goes on to, again, I think run roughshod over the Constitution and pack the court. Oh, at that point, I could totally see conservative states saying the Supreme Court is an illegitimate institution and we're not going to listen to any of their rulings.
Okay.
That's the catalyst.
I will totally say that the
catalyst.
minute they pack it, no matter what, even if they legitimately won, the minute they pack it, I will not consider anything legitimate that comes out of that court.
I'm going to tell you right now, I tend to agree with Tina on this one. I think court packing is so egregious. I think court packing is so egregious that even if, and when we say highly contested, now I agree with you that if it's highly contested and this happens, that's icing on the cake. But I'm saying you got the cake either way. And the reason for that is because I don't believe we're going to see any election cycle that is just going to be so I don't think we're going to see any more election cycles like 1984. Right?
I think Christian's saying that in order to get mass buy-in,
no, I get that.
That's what you're going to have.
But here's the point. Here's the point I'm making. This is the part where I think that makes it easier to get mass buy-in. Easy, right? I think that's a solid argument. But I think court packing in and of itself is so significant that if you had a scenario where, let's say, Joe Biden wins re-election by 2 percentage points, right? Or he wins it by a similar margin as what we saw happen in 2020. And if you see the Democrats take back control of the House, they're not going to take the House by 42 seats. They're going to take it by like 10 tops, right? They're not going to take the Senate by 5 seats. Well, they already have the Senate, right? But they're not going to drastically improve their lead. They're just going to, the difference will be is who will be the thought leaders within those institutions when they win. And I don't think a Speaker Jeffries and a Senate Majority Leader, I don't think it'll be Schumer next time. It'll be interesting to see who it potentially is.
I think Schumer will stay as,
but he could.
Even if he does, though, he would totally pack the court if he had the votes.
He'll cave, right? And this is the part where I think at that point I just don't see it. So I think that one is a potential catalyst. All right, let's go to. Well, do we have any questions?
Yes,
right.
I would disagree, and I don't think that Supreme Court packing is a sufficient catalyst because I think there are more Americans than we realize that don't know that there are 9 justices currently. I think that
That's sad.
Yeah, I think that if they packed the Supreme Court and then shortly after they did things like removing Second Amendment rights and things of that nature, I think that combination could cause a sufficient uprising.
Okay, but so Brian Betts asked a
point.
question. You say court packing is so bad. Why are you not complaining about what I think McConnell did blocking Obama's appointment while rushing through for Trump? Okay, Brian, there's a big difference. This is the part where we got to be intellectually honest. There is a huge difference between court packing and the Senate using its advise and consent to try to make sure that they get their candidates. Court packing is, by definition, you are adding new members to the Supreme Court. Right. I can point to all kinds of situations where Senates have, like, for instance, it was Harry Reid that changed the whole nature of the filibuster rules with respect to selecting Supreme Court justices. And I remember
it was lower court justices.
Lower court justices. And I remember Mitch McConnell at the time saying Democrats are going to regret doing this probably sooner than they anticipate. And lo and behold, they did. So I think if you're a Democrat and you're looking at that, you're furious with Mitch McConnell for holding up selecting 2 more Supreme Court justices until they had a Republican president. But to suggest that Democrats wouldn't have theoretically done the same thing, I think is perhaps a little bit intellectually dishonest, or at the very least, showing a little bit of bias. But here's what I will say. Had McConnell said, we're going to add 2 members to the court, like it had Trump, McConnell, and what's his face, who was Speaker of the House. Horrible decision to make him Speaker.
Ryan?
Yeah, Ryan. Had they all said, hey, now's our chance, we're going to add 2 new members of the Supreme Court or 3 members of the Supreme Court, that would have been legitimate court packing. And I can tell you right now.
The left wouldn't have liked it.
Let me just say it for public record right now. I completely oppose court packing, period, the end. I don't care who does it. Like, once you start the court packing, that is a never-ending cycle of just bad decision-making that takes place that completely undermines what the Supreme Court is supposed to be. And so I don't want either side to do it. Now, again, to your point, totally understand why people would be mad at McConnell for holding that up, but they were technically within their rights within the Senate.
He was using leverage given to him by Democrats previously.
Well, in that case, it was more. It's leverage given to him by the Constitution. Senate has advice and consent.
But the whole filibuster situation happening is what provided extra leverage.
The difference, though, is that the filibuster is not in the Constitution.
It's a Senate
and it
rule.
was Democrats that suspended the filibuster for lower court judges, and so then McConnell simply did it for the Supreme Court. We're inching towards eventually abolishing the filibuster altogether, and when that happens, I actually think that'll be another contributing factor, not a spark, because I don't think most people know what the filibuster is, but that'll be another contributing factor that leads to more political radicalization. And maybe this leads us to the next point that you want to get to, Nick, which is like some of these cultural problems, the whole culture wars in general. One thing that I've been reading a lot about lately, and I've talked to you about this, is what happened in the lead up to the Spanish Civil War. And the reason that I've been so interested in this is because I think a lot of people have this idea that a national divorce or a civil war in the U.S. will be like, the 1860s one here, where it's, states, declaring on each other and then lining up armies and then shooting each other. Like, no, I think it'll be more similar to the Spanish Civil War, which is a breakdown in civil order and government where a huge chunk of the population views that government as illegitimate and actively hostile to them, and then start arming themselves to defend themselves against the mobs of supporters of that government coming to kill them and take their stuff. And then that just spills over into more and more mob violence, fuels more and more distrust in government, which fuels more and more mob violence. And eventually you get a situation where there's already a war going and people are just waiting for something to actually trigger it. And the thing that triggered it in Spain was an attempted coup d'etat that only halfway succeeded, right? Yeah. And so I feel like that if people want an idea of a hypothetical terrible future in which these things happen, I would encourage them to go look at the lead up to the Spanish Civil War as kind of a template, because that is a much more messy scenario than the rigid structure that we had in the American Civil War.
Well, we're gonna get some questions now. Another thing too I want to point out is that we've made some changes with respect to how we do the show now. We try to keep the show within about 2 hours because we also have an audio audience and we're trying to be respectful of their time. Who we love, absolutely love our audio only audience. But at that 2 hour mark, we tend to kind of wrap up everything that we've been talking about. So we're providing kind of a complete show for all of our audio listeners as well, or anybody that can't stay around. But we do stay after that to try to get to as many of your questions as possible. So if we don't get to your question right now, we are doing our best to try to get to all of them. And we're trying to prioritize them based off of the topic as much as possible. But if you want to stay around and ask questions after that, we try to allow for some more time where we just do questions.
And we are getting so many questions now because there's a lot more viewers. So it is really possible we won't get to some of the questions, and we're just not going to be able to. At some point, we're not going to be able to keep up.
There are quite a few that I've been holding for after 2 p.m.
Okay, so let's look at this. David Harley asks, what percentage of states do you think would push back against the federal government? I feel like most smaller states who may want to may not because of the fear of being the only state pushing back. David, I think that's a good assessment. I think it's going to take major states that are willing to do it. So obviously I think when we think of major states that would be potentially willing to push back against the federal government, either through nullification, which is refusing to enforce federal law, or interposition, which is the active preventing the federal government from enforcing their own laws. You look to states like Texas, you look to states like Florida that might be willing to do that. And then I think what you would see is areas where a lot of it might actually be based on trade. So some would be based off of the federal government and their response. What does the federal government do to those states? But I do think you would need to see bigger states willing to step up and doing that. That's not to say that you might not find a very, very spunky legislature in a smaller state basically willing to say, screw this. I think that's possible. You look at certain places like Idaho right now. Look, they're not having some of this. But I do think that's what it's going to require. You're going to see some bigger states that are willing to step up, push back, and I think that's going to give some encouragement, especially to the states that probably border those that have similar feelings. Oklahoma and Texas are two that you could definitely see working cooperatively. They may hate each other's football teams, but they got a lot in common other than that.
I just read a comment that I have to read off. It's from Sir of Potatoes on the MTA chat. He said, the catalyst will be when Christian's 100 tabs self-delete, and then he brings the whole world down with him.
There would be hell to pay if my tabs get deleted.
I feel like we need bingo cards that have to do with things Christian says, like references to the Spanish Civil War, the French Revolution, his master's degree, or some other like vague
I love history. I don't know what to say.
Right.
I'm just joking with you.
I
love
believe
you,
it was.
Christian.
I believe it was Cicero who said that if you don't read
Cicero.
history or don't study history, those who don't study history will forever remain children.
Right.
That's not the exact quote, obviously, but like.
We love it, but it would provide a really fun drinking game.
So
for the MTA
Rocky Top Tom asked, will anyone dissect this, that this is all byproduct of the corporatization of the false two-party system? I don't know, because when I look at multi-party systems in Europe, I don't see, especially in parliamentarian democracies, I don't see that they've arrived at a better conclusion than what we have here within the United States. I think the two-party system is largely become popular because of what you might call the winner-take-all in most of our elections. Some people have advocated for things like a ranked choice system, which is horribly unpopular with Republicans right now. So I think that I don't know. I guess what I'm saying is that when you have a quest to have political power, parties or organizations around that and around certain values are going to develop. And other parties are permitted to take place within the system right now. Now, I will say, I think the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are given unfair advantages sometimes in state law. I've actually tried to correct for some of that in Virginia. It's very difficult, as you can imagine. So I don't think it's the overall cause of it, but I do think in some ways it could potentially contribute. Hamilton, did you have other ones that you were highlighting for us here?
Not right now.
Okay, let's move on to a third component, a third potential catalyst. And this, I think, kind of this delves into what Hamilton was saying, right? So Hamilton was saying, look, you have a court packing. I think that's bad. I think that gets a lot of people upset. But you need the packed court to do something that would really cause the problem. And so deciding to go with something incredibly controversial, what if a packed Supreme Court actually incorporated MAPs, better known as minor attracted persons.
No, better known as pedophiles.
Or what they actually are, which is pedophiles, if they actually created that as a protected class.
I would like to go first on this one.
Oh, now you want to
yes.
jump in.
Go.
All right, Hamilton, go ahead.
I think the initial reaction we would see to that is conservatives would definitely move to states where they did not have to deal with that and surround themselves with like-minded people. But I think if the federal government forced families to, or made it illegal for families to seek education through other alternatives rather than the public school system, or made private schooling illegal or homeschooling illegal in order to enforce that, I think that would be a sufficient catalyst.
All right, so Hamilton's going with that.
I'm
Christian.
not sure it would even take enforcing.
I don't think that, to be honest, it's dangerous to say. I don't think that's going to happen because I don't think that half of what we're living through.
There was a lot of things I didn't think would be possible 5 years ago.
There are so many things that were not on my bingo card for 2020.
I don't know of a single, let me put it this way. I don't know of a single Democrat candidate in the Commonwealth of Virginia, not Massachusetts, not California, not Illinois. I don't know a single Democrat running for office in the Commonwealth of Virginia that would agree with the statement, only women can get pregnant.
No,
they would feel like they had to categorize it. Well, a woman is anyone that defines themselves as a woman.
We've gone so far, and academia right now is really force feeding a lot of these people the idea that it's nothing more than a sexual preference. Well, if they're learning that in academia right now, in 20 years, they're going to be legislating it because those are the people in the legislature at that point.
I get all of that, and the slippery slope fallacy is not a fallacy; it's real.
It's real,
and we're falling off.
We're
the slope
watching it happen in real time.
I totally get all of that, but I don't. We did not have a revolution or a national divorce or any of these other things when they did all of the stuff that led up to now. Mm-hmm. I mean, Nick, I brought this up a few episodes ago, and you kind of got mad.
Just make your argument. Just make your argument.
Nick, they're mutilating children right now.
Yeah.
And we don't have people staging a revolution over that. There's literally a medical complex happening in red states as well, not just blue states, where they're mutilating children, and they're also indoctrinating children, even in red states. And you don't see people taking to the streets and literally like overthrowing governments and committing acts of violence over that. And the reason why is because ultimately the right is not inclined to use violence as a political tool like the left does. They're simply not inclined to do it. And I think part of the reason why is just because of inherent dispositions with how the left and right view the world, society, and how they operate in their day-to-day lives. You have got to push people on the right very, very far for them to have a pushback. And they don't push back gradually where it's like, oh, they do this, and then they do that, and then they do that, and then they get violent, and then they get more violent. No, it's a switch that kicks off where the right goes from not being violent to being very, very violent. When you look at right-wing backlashes, they're not these gradual things. They happen suddenly. And in fact, I think that the term that some philosophers use is the Odin switch, right? But the point is that you don't see the right doing this stuff over the fact that they're literally mutilating children right now and indoctrinating them to hate their country, hate their culture, hate their history, hate their families. And yet the right isn't doing anything that we're talking about. It's not that they're
not doing anything. It's that they're not revolting fully.
There's no national divorce. There is no national divorce. There's no civil war. There's no revolution.
Wait a second. No, what you see is state legislatures passing laws which says you can't do that in our state. And then the federal government is not coming in and telling them that they can't do it. The difference here would be the federal government is saying this is now a constitutionally protected right. Now, Special Patel in the comments said they would never try to make maps a protected class. I mean, come on, how? Let me explain. Wait a second. First of all, I think we've gotten to a point where anytime we say they would never do that, I'm a little bit skeptical, right? Because there's a lot of things that I would have thought nobody wanted to do 5 years ago that now people are not only fine with, but they will call you a bigot if you oppose it.
It starts with normalizing it.
I.e. pornography within kids' public school libraries. And anybody that's going to tell me that's not happening, and anybody that's going to tell me that nobody wants that to happen, I'm going to tell you right now, you are either horribly ignorant about what is going on, and I can speak from specifics in the Commonwealth of Virginia. I serve on the Education Committee in the Commonwealth of Virginia, right? I've seen the books. So no, nobody is going to tell me, but I will tell you this much. Anytime we bring it up, and I talk to one of my Democrat colleagues, you know what I hear? Nick, nobody wants that. Yes, you do. Not everybody that's a Democrat wants those books in there. But I will tell you right now, when we had a bill in Virginia which said if these books containing this sort of pornographic material, and I'm talking about pictures, not just literary stuff, okay, I'm not talking about a verse in the Bible describing somebody sleeping with somebody else. I'm talking about graphic depictions of children engaging in sexual activity.
With adults.
All right? That's what I'm talking about. And all our bill said, we didn't even ban the book. All the bill said was, if that book is in your public school library, you have to have a list on your website telling parents that what's there, and you have to allow parents the option to opt their child out of being able to check out that book. Not one Democrat voted for that bill. Not one. So I am tired of hearing nobody wants to. But to your question on how would they do it, let me tell you how they would potentially do it. You would create, the way this would potentially happen at the federal level has to do with things like age of consent laws. And so what they would start to do is they would start to blur the line with respect to adult, non-adult, and consent. We already have a framework for this in the United States. Consent laws are not the same as when you become an adult in most states. What you would start to see at that point is the argument that you, as an autonomous human being, and people mature at different levels, so clearly people can make, informed decisions about their own sexuality. We're already seeing it right now where kids at a very young age are having discussions about sexuality, which I would argue right now, they do not have the mental capacity to fully understand what is going on. When you are giving puberty blockers to a 10-year-old, and people say, that's not happening, when the hell do you think puberty takes place? If you're not giving him to a 10 or 11, I got news for you, you're not blocking anything. So when you're giving drugs and you're now engaging in surgeries at very young ages, don't tell me that it's impossible for someone to come to the conclusion that the same child that possesses the mental capacity to be able to make that decision for themselves, and in some states be able to do it with complete parental opposition. Don't tell me that we're so far away from a situation where a packed Supreme Court could come to the conclusion that, well, of course, a child could decide to engage in this sort of sexual expression. So it's not as if the Supreme Court is going to write a law which says, hey, pedophilia is now legal. That's not what they're going to do. They're going to categorize it as a form of sexual identity and sexual expression, which is critical to that identity and therefore must be protected. That's how they do it.
Yeah.
That is how they would do it.
They're repressed. I mean,
So look,
Brian Betts sat here and said, well, it is a sexual preference. It's just one that you're never supposed to act on. Well, I'm sorry, but most people act on whatever their sexual preference is. That's the next step. And that's where child pornography comes in and things like that. And these people will look at this stuff thinking that they're satiating their appetite for it. But really what it does is it feeds the beast, and they go and then they act on it. I mean, this idea that we're going to just look at it like it's just some kind of sexual preference. No, it's a sexual deviancy. It's a sexual perversion. It's disgusting, and these people should be separated from society, whether they've acted on it or not. If you're turned on by a little tiny child, chances are you're a little bit outside of what societal norms would say is acceptable already in other areas. I mean, people who would go and touch a child, I am very sorry, but you are not going to get any concessions out of me saying that it's just a sexual preference. No, it's a perversion. It's disgusting. And these people need to be weeded out of society, period, the end. And that's exactly what would happen if these guys became a protected class. Oh, protected from what? Well, you're going to start seeing, I'm telling you, states would start having open seasons for your protected class.
So here's what I'll say. The other thing that I will say about this is that part of the problem is that, again, in 1977 there was a petition in France in order to repeal a whole host of age of consent laws. Who was that petition signed by? It was signed by Michel Foucault. It was signed by Jacques Derrida. I think it was signed by Lyotard. It was signed by basically a whole host of left-wing philosophers tied in with postmodernism and deconstructionism. So this idea that this is something that the Supreme Court could never do, again, don't think about it in terms of the Supreme Court coming out and just making some positive statement for X, Y, and Z. All right, what they're doing is they're creating a category, and that category will implicitly lead to a whole host of questions on what age people can actually engage in certain behaviors with, to include what age they can consent to it with people that are far older than them. That's the scary part of something like this happening. So to the extent that it is possible, I do. Like 10 years ago, I would have said, absolutely not. This is not possible. I don't care where you are on the political spectrum. Nobody thinks this is okay. I don't believe that anymore, because I've seen too much evidence to the contrary on other things that I would consider to be adjacent. And so that's why
people that are reasonable making concessions for it. At this point, it's being normalized.
Yeah. So,
and if you don't think it's happening,
so that's the reason why I put it up here as a catalyst, in part because, to Christian's point, how do you get conservatives to actually get so mad that they're willing to completely upend their lives? Because that's what we're talking about with revolution. This is one of the things that I tell people all the time. When people talk with this bravado about it's just time to fight, I'm like, how much fighting have you done in your life? I've been to combat. I've seen what it looks like. You don't want it in your neighborhood. You don't want it in your state. You don't want it in your country. Believe me. But the question is what motivates people to such a degree to where they're willing to say, I don't care anymore. This is too evil. And that is usually disgust. Mm-hmm. And something like this happening at a Supreme Court level, where the federal government is now telling you, I don't care what state you live in, you will enforce this as a law. And if you don't, the federal government and federal law enforcement will come in, arrest you, and prosecute you for denying someone their constitutionally protected civil liberties. You want to talk about a catalyst? Does anybody imagine that if something like that happened at the federal level, a Governor Ron DeSantis, right, or a Governor Abbott would just sit there and be like, well, I guess that's just the law of the land? No. You would see Texas Rangers, Texas State Troopers, you'd see Florida State Troopers going in there going, you are not arresting. We convicted this person of this crime, and they're going to go to jail in Florida under Florida state law, and now the federal government is going to come in and try to prevent that from happening. You would see Florida state law enforcement. You would see local state law enforcement. You would see sheriffs saying, try it. because there is such an element of disgust associated with that they would be willing to, I honestly think that's a point where they would be willing to risk everything in order to actually fight back against that. And then the federal government would have to make some real decisions on what it is, how dedicated are they to enforcing that particular ruling, right? All right, so there's my take on it. All right, we got a couple more questions.
Let's keep moving and around 2:00.
Okay, so we got one more. So that was another catalyst. I think the general consensus here is Christian's not all that sure that this is something that's, you would say it's probably not something that's really possible, and even if it happened, what?
A contributing factor, but I mean, again, I look at where we are right now, and I don't see any reason for the slippery slope to stop until we get to this final point that you're about to get to.
The distinction is the federal versus the state.
I just want to be abundantly clear. None of the points that we have brought up so far in this podcast, I think, are going to contribute to a national divorce, civil war, revolution. I don't think any of the points that we've discussed so far are going to be the catalyst that actually kicks off any of these. I think all of them could potentially be contributing factors if and when they happen, or to varying degrees that they happen. But I don't think any of these things are actually going to, again, kick off any of those three things: national divorce, civil war, revolution.
Yeah. Okay.
I think this fourth point will, though.
All right, so here we go. The fourth point. This is the one Christian has just been waiting for.
Here's the one Christian's waiting for.
Christian's waiting. So we're going to start. We're going to make him go last. No, I'm kidding.
This is Christian's
No,
catalyst.
please. Have me go last if you want.
So no. All right. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is a larger category of major economic upheaval, and specifically what we would call sovereign debt crisis, or maybe collapse of the dollar. Christian, go ahead and lead into.
So I want to read a paragraph from Crane Brinton's book, The Anatomy of Revolution. He has this summary that he writes when he discusses the old regime before revolution actually kicks off. And I think that there's a lot in here that I think you guys are going to appreciate. Here's what he says in the summary. This is the conclusion of this chapter. He says, in summing up, the most striking thing we must know in all of these preliminary signs: government deficits, more than usual complaints over taxation, conspicuous government favoring of one set of interests over another, administrative entanglements and confusions, transfer of allegiance of the intellectuals, loss of self-confidence among many members of the ruling class, conversion of many members of that class to the belief that their privileges are unjust or harmful to society, the intensification of social antagonisms, the stoppage of certain points of the career open to talents, usually in the professions such as the arts or perhaps white-collar jobs generally, the separation of economic power from political power, and social distinction. Some, if not most of these signs may be found in almost any modern society at any time. And then he goes on to say, we are not, however, altogether helpless before some mystical gift for some short-term prophecy in the successful diagnosis of a revolution. And we can, in this instance, see further signs to revolution in all four of the examples that he brings up: English Civil War, or English Revolution, American Revolution, French Revolution, and Russian Revolution. And all of them, and especially in France and Russia, there is, at the actual outbreak of revolution approaches, increasing talk of revolution, increasing consciousness of social tension, increasing cramp and irritation. Prophets of evil there always are. But, and then he mentions that there were people predicting a French Revolution 40 years before it actually happened.
Yeah.
But then he goes on to basically say that there's increasing discussion, chatter in the air of something's going to happen.
Yeah.
And even though each of these points that he brings up, mostly economic related that I just read through, he says that, yeah, any of these things can happen in societies at any point in time. In fact, any society, at least one of those points is happening. But what you need a combination of all of them coming together at once, and it needs to have a catalyst that is driven by economics. His thesis here is that you get a revolution, you get political upheaval that's not settled through the ballot box, when you have an era of growing economic prosperity, even if it's somewhat modest, that then comes to a halt. And the reason that it comes to a halt, people conclude, is because of government ineptitude or government action directed against them, against their own economic self-interests. And when that happens, it's always fermented through a crisis of the government itself. Members of the government losing interest within that government, feeling like the government that they're serving is inept, and then the government itself being bankrupt. So the phrase could be that in France, before the revolution, in many ways, people have this picture that before the French Revolution, the people were poor and it was the peasants that rose up. And it was not the serfs that rose up in France. It wasn't even the serfs that rose up in Russia. The Bolsheviks were not the peasants in the fields. They used peasants in the fields, but Lenin was not a peasant, right? Like in France, it was the country was actually getting richer before the revolution. And then something happened to stop that economic progress. There were many things that contributed to it. And at the same token, the government itself was bankrupt. Utterly bankrupt. They had been funding the wars in the Netherlands and in the Low Countries for decades under Louis XIV, and then they funded the American Revolution. And so what you get is a government triggered economic crisis at the same time that the rest of society is relatively well off.
So in the U.S., because right now we're the wealthiest nation in the world by far,
but the government is dirt broke.
the government is obviously over $30 trillion in debt. However, people have been listening to the government is in horrible debt for decades now. They don't buy that it's the same problem that it was, in part because it wasn't as big a problem in the 80s because we weren't in as much debt. But now you have a combination of massive amounts of debt, you have inflationary monetary policy, and you have to have that inflation in order to actually pay for all of the government programs that the federal government is now taking responsibility, Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, things like that. So the point is that, okay, at what point, what do you see? Because economic crisis can mean a lot of things. What do you see as the point where it's like, oh, crap?
That's a good point. Economic crisis could be, I mean, we didn't have a revolution when the, housing crisis hit and the banking crisis hit in 2008. So it's not sufficient that you just have, a market crash and suddenly people in the streets. No, what you need is, you need something that, how do I say this? You need multiple things to go wrong at once, not just one thing. So like the 80s, one thing went wrong. We had stagflation in the 70s, which is, high unemployment and high inflation. And so that led to 19% interest rates. That was pretty bad. But we also had a very low debt to GDP ratio at the time, and we could afford 19% inflation rates because the amount of debt in circulation was much lower than today, right? We had a huge crash.
You also had a lot more cultural cohesion within the United States, comparatively speaking. You also had the Soviet Union, which represented which represented what was considered to be an existential external threat, and that historically has always been a way to unify people.
Yeah. So I mean, China can serve that too, but I don't think that is going to stop it. But you had crashes before it, the dot-com bubble, the 2008 crash. So it's not that you just need a crash. You need multiple things going wrong at once. And here's the problem. Everything in the macroeconomic system is about to go wrong all at once.
Be specific.
So we have record high debt. We also have record high deficits. We also have almost a record high debt to GDP level. It's been higher than at any point other than the peak of World War II. And we're about to surpass that in the near future. Just give it a couple years and we will be at a higher debt to GDP level than even in World War II. So you have record debt, record deficits, record debt to GDP, because it doesn't matter if you have a bunch of debt if the economy's booming, right? Yeah. Well, it does matter, but you get my point. So like, those are all going wrong at once. You have long-term, over the last 40 years, interest rates have been falling, and until just a few years ago, they were effectively zero. You can't go lower than zero. You literally can't have interest rates lower than zero because then it's, you're paying me to take out a loan. Yeah, to take out. So like, point is that they can't go lower than zero. Interest rates can only go up from here. And the reason why they can only go up is pretty simple. Even if the Fed currently is raising them, right? Yeah. But let's say that tomorrow the Fed said, we've won the fight against inflation. Now we need to cut because the market's suffering or whatever.
Well, and there'll be a lot of political pressure to do so.
But interest rates long-term in the next 10 to 20 years are probably going to keep going higher regardless of what the Fed does. And the reason why is because when the Fed finally returns to the Fed put, right, of trying to prop up the market, which they will eventually do once they think they've either got inflation under control or they're forced to do so for political reasons. Point is that they will eventually pivot at some point. When they do, inflation will kick back up again. We're probably going to see a return to the 70s of cyclical cycles of inflation throughout this decade. The problem is that who's going to loan the government money at a loss? If the interest rate is 2%, but the inflation rate is 5%, who's going to buy treasuries? You're losing money doing that. And so people are going to demand a higher return, which means a higher interest rate in exchange for their loan. And at the same time that you're seeing Japan selling treasuries, Japan is now a net seller of treasuries, and they're also the largest holder of foreign treasuries. They have like over $1 trillion of treasuries. China is a net seller of treasuries. Currently, the Federal Reserve is a net seller of treasuries. They're drawing down their balance sheet. The largest institutional holders of treasuries are now net selling. That will drive up interest rates because there's an inverse relationship between interest rates and bond prices. And so what you're going to see is even if the Fed tries to continue with yield curve control, right? Tries to keep interest rates down, there's ultimately not a lot that can be done to keep interest rates down because ultimately the market will demand a higher interest rate if they know that if they don't, they're going to be losing money. Nobody loans money at a loss. Nobody does that. And so what you're going to see is artificially the decades of keeping interest rates at artificially low levels is going to come to an end one way or another. No matter what the Fed does, all roads lead to Rome. As those interest rates rise, the federal government, unless it balances its budget, and let's be honest, they're never going to do that, they're going to have to keep taking on new debt at a higher interest rate to pay off the old debt at a lower interest rate just to fund the government. And so eventually you're going to get to a point where it's already like...
It's a death spiral.
It's a death spiral. And so what do you get at that point? Eventually what you're going to get is a situation where the only institution that will be able to loan money to the government is the one that will be mandated to do so, which is the federal government or the Federal Reserve, that will have to print dollars to then buy treasuries to give Congress the money to spend on their, gender programs in Pakistan, right? And at that point, every new dollar that's added to Congress, that Congress is spending over the amount that they're taking in is a dollar added to the money supply. That's where you get the debt spiral. When that happens, that's when you get a Weimar moment. And the tragedy is that we've seen from history that people conclude quite often, apparently, that Weimar problems require Weimar solutions. And we don't want Weimar solutions.
No, we don't want authoritarianism coming. Well, and Kenneth Brown asked an interesting question. He goes, what about mass partisan debanking or confiscation to prop up the failing dollar? And Kenneth, that's an excellent question because I do think... I think partisan debanking is going to be a lot more difficult than people think it's going to be, in part because when you've got institutions like, not just in like the banking or our local savings and loan, but when you have people that essentially control investment, like BlackRock, they don't totally control, but when you have 10 trillion in assets, one of the reasons why we have all these DEI scores and ESG taking place or whatnot is because institutions like BlackRock require it. Otherwise, they won't loan money to you. And that creates a big problem. The question is what sort of mechanism is going to exist within the marketplace to rise up as competition for it, and will the government intend to intervene? One of the biggest problems that I have with Elizabeth Warren is her constant drumbeat that, we need more banking regulations. We need more banking regulations. She doesn't mean that because she wants you as the small depositor to be in a better position. She wants the government to control banking or to have such control over banking that essentially they can manipulate that process. And that is terrifying to me because banking is supposed to be one of two things. You putting your money in a safe location for which you pay a small fee, or if you're talking about fractional reserve banking, it's you're giving your money to an institution which you allow to invest a portion of it, and then they either pay you a small amount to keep the money there, but then they also provide other services which allow you to easily distribute your money to other entities or whatnot for a variety of commercial purposes or economic purposes. And the more the government gets to control that entire process, ostensibly in order to protect you, the harder they make it for competition to be able to enter the marketplace. And I believe that's a far greater motivation for someone like Elizabeth Warren than it is, we just want to make sure all the small depositors... Really? So you're telling me the same federal institution, which is over $30 trillion in debt because they've so poorly mismanaged their own assets, is going to give banks a lesson on how to do it effectively or properly? I don't buy that.
There's an article that I read from Seeking Alpha. It's an investment website. It's actually a fantastic investment website. And there was this article that was published in January, titled "In case of a U.S. sovereign debt crisis, gold may be the best place to hide." Now, this is not me advertising gold. Buy Freedom Gold, right? But there were some points in this article, and by the way, I mean, gold is just a yellow rock. I mean, it's a fantastic asset to hold to preserve your buying power. But I mean, you could do the same thing with Bitcoin or Ethereum. You could do the same thing with silver if you want. But there were some points in this article that were fantastic, that I think contribute to the whole question of why I think the economic thing and the economic crisis, and specifically a sovereign debt crisis, tied to a collapse of the dollar as a result, is going to be the thing that basically kicks it all off.
So clarify that, because I think everybody watching this, regardless of where you're at, kind of like in your economic literacy, everyone understands that, okay, yeah, inflation, especially hyperinflation, tends to be very, very corrosive, not only for an economy, but for a society. And a lot of times people have this idea that like, well, we're not talking about economics, we're talking about people. The economy is people. That's what it is. It's not an engine. It's not a machine. It's not anything. The economy is nothing more, or it really is nothing more than people attempting to improve their own lives, provide for their basic needs and services, desires and whatnot through exchange. That's what the economy is. And when you create a situation where one of the primary mechanisms of a advanced economy, i.e. a dependable currency, all of a sudden disappears, or when I say all of a sudden, I don't mean like overnight, but in a very, very short period of time, where now the mechanism that you have, the primary mechanism that you have, which is control of whatever currency you possess, to go out and exchange for goods and services, all of a sudden is worthless or gone. Mm-hmm. That creates a crisis point. We saw that in the Weimar Republic. We've seen it in other countries as well. And when you have now you can survive it, right? You can get through it with various mechanisms. But I think what Christian's saying, I think what you're about to get into now, is when you have a combination of things like hyperinflation or a collapse of the dollar plus a sovereign debt crisis, there's another component that's added into that facilitates, that goes from a really bad economic situation to people in the streets with guns demanding, revolution.
Yeah. Like, I mean, when they had hyperinflation in the Weimar Republic, there was an attempt to overthrow the government called the Cap Putsch. Yeah. And so the points that this guy had, I just want to go through a few of them to really explain what I meant by everything is going to go wrong all at once. So remember when I brought up earlier that like we have over $32 trillion. Actually, I think it's now like $33 trillion in debt, the highest debt to GDP ratio, largest deficit as well. And we're going to be looking at a long-term trajectory in the next 10 to 20 years of higher interest rates, not lower. This guy actually brings up the same points. And he was like, any of those four factors could potentially be survivable by a nation in isolation from one of the other negative circumstances. The problem in 2023 is that all four of these storms are now hitting the target simultaneously. It is the perfect storm, a once in a 300-year Category 7 twister. Nobody alive today has seen anything like this happening in U.S. markets in their lifetime. And then here's the 4 points that he has. I take the four components of this Category 7 perfect financial storm in turn. And he says the first point is you could deal with a record debt if the economy was booming with higher GDP growth, or if the deficit was zero or negative, or if interest rates were falling. But the opposite is happening. Yeah. You could deal with a rapidly growing budget deficit for a while if it came on the backs of having no debt or being a net creditor, so that you could invest for a while and then pay it off with superior economic growth and or a higher level of personal savings. But the opposite is currently happening. You could deal with sharply rising interest rates, this gets back to the 80s thing, if the debt level was low and falling, or if the budget deficit was low or falling. But the opposite is happening. You could deal with a huge swing from quantitative easing, money printer go burr, to quantitative tightening, which is what the Fed is currently doing by selling off, letting their assets fall off their balance sheet. If all three of the above factors were going in the opposite direction, but the opposite is happening. In short, every single factor that could be tilted over the U.S. fiscal ship is in the wrong direction is currently happening. It is a 4 out of 4 in terms of deadly macroeconomic blows, all happening at once. I mean, he basically says...
Can you sum up what exactly that would mean for the average person if this finally did clinch it? What would that mean for the average person, and what would their individual responses look like that would make that a catalyst? What do you think they'd do?
You go to the store and you try to buy eggs, and you see that it costs $10,000 for a carton of eggs.
Well, okay, let me put it another way. you get your Social Security check, but it's meaningless because the amount of money that is actually mandated to you by the federal government can no longer keep up with inflation. So your Social Security check is meaningless. It pays for nothing. Same thing is now true of Medicaid and Medicare. So now you can't. Now the three major consumptions of non-discretionary spending in the United States it is essentially worthless. So now you have a significant portion of the voting population which can no longer rely on things that they were told they could rely on for both their health and their basic sustenance. Not to mention the fact that you're now operating in an environment where those of you who are not dependent on one of those three programs find yourselves in a situation where you can't afford anything either because, again, the inflationary economy makes your fiat currency, your dollar, effectively worthless. Now I want you to imagine the first way that we try to deal with this is politically. Well, politically, the way they're going to try to deal with this, we've got to save all of these unsustainable federal programs. Well, how are you going to do that? You're going to tax more. Okay, you're going to tax people at the time where the economy is already failing. And now you're going to drive division between different people that are fighting for different things within the federal government. You're going to have politicians that rise up and essentially say, no, they're the bad guys. We're the good guys. Support us and we'll get this. So you're going to see a lot of that.
At that point, they start finger pointing and deciding who's to blame for it.
Yes, but the next point, though, the next problem is this. All of a sudden, you have widespread civil disorder going on because the very things that people were dependent upon, their currency, their Medicaid, their Social Security, their job, everything is gone. So now people are rioting. People are burning things down. People are looting. So you call in the police, but you can't pay them. So you call up the military, but you can't pay them. How do you enforce the law when all of a sudden the very mechanism that you have to ensure that the people that are responsible for enforcing it will actually go out and physically do it can no longer be paid because you have an absolute crisis on your hands?
I see that as a disintegration of the republic, but I don't necessarily see that as national divorce.
Those two things are the same thing in my opinion.
Not really. The reason I say they're not is because you have ideological diametrically opposed factions within the United States. So in order to have a divorce kind of situation where it's almost sort of a civil war scenario, you have to have somewhat clear lines of who's who and who's causing this. And it's not just going to be the government doing it. And now it's just...
Well, that's okay. Keep in mind
the problem is I think...
We already... Well, wait a second. To be fair... We already talked about there's three conditions, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so the point is what's a catalyst? Assuming these three conditions are met, what's a catalyst? What Christian's arguing, and I think he's right. I don't know that it will be the one, but if it happens, it definitely causes problems because this leads into point 3, right? Is what is the response from the feds, from individual people, and what is the response from the states?
Yeah, I was going to ask you a question about that, but let me know if
well, what we have is when you have a situation where your currency is essentially worthless, or let's say just next to worthless, and now you have different people competing because they're so dependent on federal programs which can no longer be properly financed without either massive borrowing, printing, or taxing. Right, but then you run into the additional problem of not being able to actually fund the agencies you require to go in and actually impose your federal will through law enforcement. Okay, what happens? Well, it's not that all of a sudden everybody just runs into the woods and sets up individual tribes and start becoming hunters and gatherers. They start looking for other authority structures that they actually have more faith in. And that's the part where I look at it as the individual response to something like this is you move to a place where you can actually, you're either not going to be harassed by people that are rioting and looting and robbing, or there's some semblance of order still in place. So those states which are actually better equipped to provide some level of stability, whether it be economic or just safety from a social standpoint, those ones are going to fare better. And as a result, they're going to draw population. People are going to vote with their feet. And so the real question is going to be is as these things start to develop, because states are going to start to come up with their own policies and they're going to differ from one another on what they actually do. And we already see some of the questions up here. Like, so for instance, Bob asked, the people having an alternative to the US dollar and it's crypto. Do you see any state adopting a cryptocurrency to protect itself from the Federal Reserve? I think what's far more likely to happen is the Federal Reserve is going to push its own crypto.
It'll push a CBD, a central bank digital currency.
Yeah, essentially that's the CBDC. But I do think what you can see happening on the state level is, and what's interesting enough, BRICS, which was China's alliance between Brazil, Iran, China,
India,
South
India,
Africa.
not Iran.
Oh, sorry, yeah, Brazil, India, China, Russia, and South Africa. Right, they're actually trying to come up with an alternative currency to the dollar, so the dollar would no longer be the reserve currency, and they're actually trying to make it precious metals backed. Which there's a lot of problems with BRICS. I don't think it's actually going to be able to pull off a lot of what it wants to do. But a currency backed in some way, shape, or form by some sort of precious metal, which doesn't allow for hyperinflation, what will actually be a very, very appealing currency to invest in as a hedge against purely fiat currency,
especially if it's accepted internationally.
And that's going to be the part where you're going to start to see states, and this creates something of a constitutional crisis, right? Because the federal government does have authority with respect to U.S. currency. But if the federal government mismanages it so badly to where states are like, look, you're not providing us an alternative, we have to come up with something in order to ensure that commerce can exist, and we can't do it with Federal Reserve notes anymore. That's where you get into another state response to a crisis like this, where you see a place like Florida going, sorry, we're going to start issuing our own currency. Or we're going to allow for more of a free banking system where banks are actually allowed to have currency. Because
or you just have competing currencies in the form of crypto,
you have competing
Bitcoin
currencies.
or Ethereum, or I've made the argument before that Dogecoin actually could be a currency because it's inflationary, but it's fixed to an algorithm, so you can't meddle with it like a central bank can.
Yeah.
Nick, the question that I was going to ask you earlier is, you actually said that you agreed with me when I brought up the whole economic stuff, and I was reading off this book, and I was reading in this article, and what I was trying to get across is that, like, look, any of these problems that we've talked about in this episode and before on the economic front has happened before, but we've never ever in history had all of these things all come together all at once. And this is why I've said over and over again in previous podcasts that I think that the thing that's going to trigger the right-wing backlash, or whatever you want to call it, is going to be economic in nature, because people are not going to march out in the streets if their favorite politician gets thrown in jail.
Yeah.
People are not going to march out in the streets if a Supreme Court ruling doesn't go their way. People will march out onto the streets if they're literally on the verge of going homeless and hungry, and they remember just a few years ago they were living a comfortable lifestyle. And so this is why I think the economic crash, big time sovereign debt crisis, death of the dollar type situation is what will trigger this from happening. And I'm also convinced that it's going to happen because there's no incentive to cut spending in Washington, D.C. The end result is going to be this debt spiral, this hyperinflationary debt spiral. So the question I have for you is, and maybe I just explained the first half of it, but why are you convinced that scenario that I listed out just a minute ago is the actual thing that will be the catalyst? This is the Franz Ferdinand moment. That's the first half. And then the second half is, if you do think that is the Franz Ferdinand getting assassinated moment that kicks this whole thing off, what do you think the response is going to be at the federal level, the state level, the individual or local level?
I think I don't necessarily know that this will be the catalyst. I know if it happens, it has to be the catalyst. Does that make sense? It's not that something else couldn't happen from one of the other things that we've mentioned that could kickstart everything. But if this happens, that's a catalyst that is going to result in some sort of massive departure from what we currently understand the United States to be as a legal and political entity, right? There will have to be. And it's for the reason that you said. Why do I believe that? Because I've opened up a history book more than once in my life. Whenever you deal with situations with massive economic decline, especially in a relatively short period of time, with a people that was not used to it, right? We're not talking about perpetual poverty over decades. We're talking about things going relatively good and then it tanking pretty quickly. It becomes very easily both for people to be justifiably upset, but also for political demagogues to do their best work with respect to isolating people, putting them into groups, and then pointing at other people as their enemies. Because some of them might even be right on some level, right? And the problem that we have right now within the United States and within the federal government is it is untenable. I say this as someone that has been a candidate for Congress. It is untenable to go out there and say federal spending on non-discretionary programs like Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare is unsustainable, and that these programs are fundamentally problematic. It's not that they've just been mismanaged. It's not that we don't pay enough in taxes. It's not that we don't have enough economic growth to sustain them. They are fundamentally flawed at a level where you cannot sustain them in perpetuity with the way that they're currently constructed. You just can't. The incentive structure is wrong. I said that Social Security has been run like a Ponzi scheme, and I had the amount of Republicans, people that agreed with me theoretically or in principle. Nick, you can't say that. I'm like, but it's true. Yes, but people are going to think that you're anti-Social Security.
That's why we're doomed.
And that is the point. That is the point.
Because speaking the truth equals political suicide.
When you have gotten to the point where you can look somebody in the eye and you can say, I am sorry that you were sold a bag of goods by the federal government on these programs, but they're not financially sustainable, and here is why. You know what response I get back? And FDR knew this when he instituted. The response I get back is, but I paid into that. I'm owed that. And the idea is that, well, if I'm owed something by the government, well, then clearly by law, they have to come through. Laws don't change the fundamental nature of reality. If the federal government no longer has the capacity to make good on their promises, they don't get to pass a law which says, we've made good on our promises. They can do it, but it won't change the fundamental reality of the fact that you can no longer buy bread. And that's the part that people are going to come to a very, very hard realization on if we don't make some sort of massive correction. Now, the question, to answer the second part of your question, the reason why it's so fundamental and will be the catalyst if it takes place is because it will affect everybody on a fundamental level. Except for like the extremely wealthy or those in political power, it'll take longer to affect them because they'll be able to escape. But they're even going to have problems with it as well. But once you have massive social disunity like that, and you already have a culture that is no longer as close-knit as it used to be by the institutions which used to define it, like religion, marriage, civic organizations, or even at this point, a dedication toward the idea that our national level institutions are fundamentally secure, right? When that's gone away, you're going to get fractionalization. You're going to get a lot of problems. And then the question will be is what will individuals do at that point? Well, individuals at that point are terrified. They're looking for some level of security. What will the federal government try to do? The federal government will try to reassert itself as the overriding authority, but their capacity to do so will be severely diminished. What will states do? Some states will side with the federal government because that's what they've done, and they don't know how to run any programs without federal dollars anyways. Other states will reassert their own authority and jurisdiction and start to question the sort of power that the federal government has. And those states are going to be in a position where they're going to be able to provide some level of physical security, social security, and economic security. And what I don't know is how individuals respond to that, because I know the initial desire will be get from the economically, socially, and physically unsafe areas, unstable areas, and get to the ones that are safe. Leave the states where people are rioting and burning things in the streets and get to the states that seem to be functioning relatively securely. The problem is what happens when they get there? Do they actually recognize? Like, this is the problem we've had before with the locust versus the refugee. The refugee understands what they've left, why they've left it, and are appreciative of where they're at. The locust never seems to realize that it's their behaviors and practices we're actually creating the famine. And so wherever they go, they just create more of it. And that's the part where you're going to reach a crisis point where certain states will say, this is what we believe and this is what we do and this is why you're coming here. And if you come here to try to change it, it's not going to be state police. It's going to be citizens of those states going, no, you screwed up all of this and you don't get to come here and tell us what to do. You get to sit there, shut up, and be happy that nobody's burning down your store anymore. Or burning down your house. And that's going to be a part where you're going to actually, again, it's a horrible, I don't want to see this because that's a horrible part where people feel a sense of righteous indignation that we warned this was coming, you did it anyways, and now you have the audacity to not accept some measure of responsibility for what your philosophy wrought? And now you want to come to the safe area and you want to tell us how to do it? That's the part where you're going to see a lot of social friction. So when I look at the catalyst and when I look at what the state, federal, and individual responses is, federal is going to try to reassert its authority. State is going to reassert authorities that it gave up a long time ago, and individuals are going to flee to wherever they think they're going to be the most safe.
Real quick, I want to thank Nico for his super chat. He said, Christian is right regarding economic collapse. Most Americans have never seen what a third world country looks like. If you have normal Americans not being able to get running water for the first time, it will be a catalyst for chaos.
I think he's absolutely right.
Oh, as soon as he said Christian is right, I immediately knew that it was going to be a great take.
I have a question. This isn't in our list, but I do kind of wonder this. After we all went through the COVID lockdowns and we all dealt with how vicious and vile people became toward one another. I mean, just trying to intimidate each other, trying to shame each other. And this happened on both sides of the argument, but it really was much more heavy on one particular side. So what I'm wondering is, there was, if you'll remember, we all sort of got swept up into it at first going, wow, how bad is this going to be? And we all started fixating on the numbers. And of course, the numbers were skewed because it looks as though we had COVID here way sooner than they thought. So the mortality rate was completely skewed because you didn't even know that some people, you wouldn't even know they were sick. And so the mortality rate was nowhere near what they were saying it was, the whole deal. And so on the other side of this, obviously hindsight tends to be 20/20. In this situation, we're still trying to get a clear view of it because the subterfuge was so deep. But after seeing how all of this went down and looking at how much more skeptical a good half to 60% of our society is now, because I know people who got the shot, got the vaccine, they were really big into masking during the time. And then on the other side of it now, they feel super betrayed. They will never fall for that again. They wish they had never done it. They feel like they were duped. Now they're encountering health problems because of the jab, whatever it may be. Now that we're on the other side of this, do you think another pandemic scare that is maybe a different type of illness now? I mean, let's say Ebola or something. Now, of course, Ebola is so much worse than COVID because of what it does to your body.
Hemorrhagic fever. When
you're bleeding out of your orifices and your eyeballs.
And it kills you.
But if we suddenly had another scare, like a new strain of COVID, or there's some other kind of thing, how many people at that point would be like, I'm done. I'm not doing this with you again. And they're like 20 more days of lockdown. We're going to shut down your business.
I think what would happen is that blue states would do the lockdowns because they just seem to love them. I think more red states now would enter this with an extreme degree of skepticism, and more people would be, I think a significantly larger portion of the population would be less likely to follow the government approved science. Right. They would want to see facts. They would want to see evidence, and they would not be bullied into it either. There was a whole lot of social pressure to engage in certain activities that we only learned later were not necessarily that beneficial. And so I think I think it would be an interesting response, but I think you would see, I don't think it'd be a catalyst for stuff as much as it would be certain states that would respond one way, other states that would respond other ways. And the federal government, again, what's going to be their approach? Is the federal government going to come in and try to, that's what it would take. It would take the federal government coming in and telling Florida, no, you will engage in these lockdowns, in which case Florida says no. And then how does the federal government actually, enforce it? So, all right, let me do a quick wrap up here because we're gonna get to just questions. We're gonna get to the segment of the show where we're just handling questions. So we're gonna do a wrap up here. Bottom line is like we said before, there's 3 conditions associated with this idea of national divorce. And this is not just for the United States. This is what we've looked at through history with any country. One is that you have significant portions of the population. And by significant, I mean, numerous numerous and, politically and economically powerful that have diametrically opposed visions for the country. Right? They fundamentally disagree on the overall nature of the country. They fundamentally disagree on the institutions of the country, and they certainly fundamentally disagree on the direction that the country should take. We already have that. That condition has been met. The second condition is people start to geographically separate. They start to self-sort into the areas which they feel better reflect the sort of environment that they want to live in. And so within the United States, we know we have different regions that are very different socially, culturally, economically, politically. So again, we're starting to see more and more people that are starting to move to different locations, not simply because they got a new job offer, because the weather is nice. They're actually moving for politically, ideologically motivated reasons, and that is very, very different. However, I don't think any of us believe that has actually happened on a level that would be sufficient to actually have a national divorce take place. But the pendulum is swinging more in that direction, where people are moving for the politics, not just the weather or the job opportunities. That leaves the third condition. And the third condition is, again, we talked about diametrically opposed visions for the country, both where we've been and where we're going. It's one of those sides taking such significant control of the federal government. That means the House, the Senate, the presidency, and the Supreme Court, to where they can essentially ram through whatever they want. Now, there's two things that are required here. One, they have to have that level of political control. And two, they have to actually use that level of political control or believe it's appropriate for the federal government to impose that on the rest of the country. Right now, that largely resides with the left wing of the political spectrum, but there are elements within the right that are also saying that, hey, they're willing to impose that as well. But if one side gets control of that and decides to ram it home through things like court packing, that's going to be a real problem. And then we discussed the catalyst. I think the main catalyst that is a surefire way, and by that I mean, if it happens, we're going to see massive problems, and we're going to see the most likely episode for national divorce is the one that Christian brought up, and that is significant economic collapse. Now, that doesn't mean that there couldn't be a lot of things that would, facilitate greater division if Trump was jailed, but Hunter Biden got a pass. If the left wing got in there and they packed the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court did something that was seen as so egregious that states decided to push back against federal law or push back against federal edicts. All of those things would be contributing factors. But I'm going to have to, my personal opinion is, I think Christian's accurate. Once you get a combination of those things, plus a significant economic collapse, that's where you see all of this coming to a head. And the real question is going to be, what do various entities do about it? I think the federal government is going to try to reassert their authority, and I think they're going to be willing to use violence and coercion in order to do it. I think states are going to start to not only assume authorities that used to existed at the state level, but I think they're going to start to question and push back, especially things within the Constitution like the 16th Amendment, as well as the federal government having sole responsibility for the management of the currency. I think that's something that states would fight back on. As far as individuals, I think individuals are going to be going straight for wherever they think is going to provide them some degree of physical safety as well as economic safety. They want to go someplace where their property isn't going to be confiscated either by a mob or by agents of the government, right? Now, I don't want any of this to happen, right? I'm not a doomsdayer. I don't want any of this to happen. I want us to understand historically what has happened in other countries so we can prevent it from happening here. And the next episode that we're going to do on Thursday is actually going to lay out specifics, things that people can do at a federal level, at a state level, and at an individual and a community level, at a family level, things that they can do that actually reinforce what I believe are the best aspects of what it means to be an American. And this does mean things like respecting individual liberty, respecting things like free markets, respecting things like property rights, and actually teaching your kids to be able to appreciate these things and to be able to live within a society that is so close-knit, right? That when bad things do happen that are beyond your control, you have mechanisms not only to be able to sustain yourself economically and socially, but what you really have is the ultimate argument. Because when things are going really bad, people are automatically going to search for what is actually working. In the midst of the chaos, what is working? And we think we have some ideas to be able to put across to our audience that we want input on, but we think we have a mechanism that can actually help facilitate that, to once again make the greatest argument possible, which is not just the words that you use, but the way you live your life and how it reflects and interacts with reality in order to present good solutions. So I want to thank all of you for joining us today. I want to thank you for the questions you've given so far. We're going to move into the question segment. I also want to once again thank Good Ranchers. I know people don't like ads. I know that. There's a reason why we don't do a lot of ads. But the reason why we decided to team with Good Ranchers is because we not only appreciate the values that they have as a company, we appreciate the quality products and services that they provide. And that's one of our commitments to you. We're never going to join in to any sort of economic deal with anybody that we don't think is actually providing you something of quality. And Good Ranchers absolutely does that. And again, with the promo code Nick, you can get $30 off your order, plus you can get free shipping. I think that's a good deal. If you just want to try them out, go look at one of their packages, find something that you like, try it out. We were not disappointed. And believe me, I was looking for an excuse to be disappointed. They actually produce a really, really good product, and I think you're going to like the values of the company as well. Once again, thank you for joining us on this episode. For those of us on our audio platform, thank you again for bearing with us. We know that the episodes have gotten a little bit longer. We've had some people talk to us about that, but we think we're having good conversations. We hope it's worth your while. We are now going to move into the question segment on our YouTube, Rumble, and every other channel. Once again, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next episode. For everyone else, let's get to some of the questions.
All right.
There was a question asking if I would become dictator.
Okay.
Yeah.
I never got a chance to answer that. And no, I don't believe in dictators, even if they're me.
It was a super chat. Let me go back and find that because I want to show the super chat.
Okay.
But hold your answer because it was a good one. Okay. So we're going to prioritize our Rumble and MTA folks here for a little while. We apologize for seeming to have ignored y'all for a little bit. Intensive Care Bear, very active member of our circle chat, which you can join at the link in the description. She says, will we ever get a positive episode again? Or are you changing the name to making the argument for depression? Y'all are killing me.
Yes, actually, the next episode, if stick around Thursday, we've given a lot of thought to this. And
I think we should just do a lighthearted, hilarious episode at some point. Oh, wait, we did aliens already. Okay, go ahead.
we were actually talking about this, and we were looking at several episodes. We had looked at our community chat, and we had looked at certain things that people wanted us to talk about. And we had also looked at some of our episodes that have been popular before. And one of the things that we decided is the reason why we were going to do this one is because we did want to address some of these major issues. But then we wanted to follow it up with an episode that we actually are all pretty excited about because we think it's going to provide all of us an opportunity to work on a project that is not just esoteric in the sense that, oh, okay, go out and vote better, right? It's not that. We wanted to start to look at how do we help build communities of people that are like-minded in the sense that not that we agree on everything, but we certainly agree on the idea that we want a society where people can be happy, healthy, prosperous, and free. And how do we facilitate greater conversation among that? And how do we facilitate things like the sharing of skills, right? The sharing, like creating a marketplace. And that's what we're going to talk about on Thursday. I think it's actually going to be a very uplifting and encouraging conversation because it gives people practical things that they can focus on. And one of the most important things when so much talk, especially on the news, is doom and despair and gloom, and people don't just want to hear like, well, hopefully we'll get a better president. No. What are things that we can do on an individual level? And we're going to actually be sharing some of the experiences that people have had on our community chat, as well as some of the other people that we're actually starting to work with a little bit more, because I think it is going to lead to something that you're going to enjoy. So stick around for Thursday's episode.
Okay, this is a question from Rawl. He says, how would a national divorce affect the National Guard?
So that's interesting. The National Guard used to be, we used to have much more reliance on state militias, which didn't receive as much federal funding. Obviously that changed throughout the course of American history, but it's interesting. If you read anything about the Civil War, you'll realize that the vast majority of like the Army of the Potomac, which was the Union Army, the Federal Army, was not federal troops. It was the 200th Pennsylvania, it was the 20th Maine, it was the 1st Massachusetts. These were all state militias which had been called up by the federal government in order to participate, obviously, in the Civil War, right? And you saw the same thing within the Confederacy, the 7th Virginia, right? The 22nd Mississippi. We moved far away, and the reason why we moved far away from the idea of the old state militia model was in large part because of federal funding. So now your National Guard still, the governor is still considered the commander-in-chief of your local National Guard, but the federal government provides so much of the funding and can call them up and federalize the National Guard. There's actually been a movement lately, and it's something I'm very interested in, called the Defend Our Guard Act. And one of the things it's attempting to do is to reestablish the National Guard, not simply as another mechanism or arm of the regular army or the regular military, but to put certain restrictions on how the National Guard can be called up and utilized. Now, if you pass that, the threat from the federal government is going to be you're going to lose federal funding. What will be interesting to see is which states are willing to say, you know what, it's worth it. We'd rather lose the federal funding than continually to see our guardsmen be federalized and be sent off either into wars for which there has been no declaration of war. And we're willing to take the federal loss. I think that would actually create a much closer relationship between National Guard units and the states that they come from. The other thing that you're starting to see, like in places like Virginia, we have a Virginia Defense Force, which is completely separate from the National Guard. You're actually seeing Florida look at instituting something else, which is going back to more of a state militia model. So I think what would happen in an area where if you really did have a significant breakdown is National Guard equipment, which is housed in that state, would largely be probably used and confiscated by state officials in order to help maintain order and protect the civilian populace. That's one potential thing that could happen if any of the horrible things that we're talking about ever did manifest.
Loyal to Law says, question, say the country is about to divorce. Will the country be two different countries, or will we go through a civil war 2.0?
So this is something Christian and I think we have similar beliefs on this. I don't think let me put it, I don't think you would see, and I hope you wouldn't see something where you would have, two different countries or maybe multiple different countries. It was fascinating. When Trump got elected, it was the left in California that was holding up signs saying that California is a nation, not a state. And so you actually had a very small, very limited movement in California. Again, very, very small. But this idea that, well, look, California is the fourth largest economy in the world. Why shouldn't we be our own country? So obviously, if you found a scenario where it got really bad, you could see individual states breaking away from the country as a whole, maybe setting up their own states or their own nations, or coming up with some sort of agreement among other states where they would have some sort of are we allowed to say confederacy? But that's what it would be. It would be a confederation between states. We're not referring to the old Confederacy.
This is more like a Star Wars confederation.
Yeah, you could see something like that taking place. I honestly think what I hope would happen if it ever got that bad is that you would see an initial fracturing, not in the sense where states were just declaring we are no longer a part of the United States. I think what you'd have is more of a constitutional crisis and the federal government recognizing that it doesn't actually have the ability to impose its will in the way that it did either in the 1860s or at other times in American history. I think you would see a situation where the federal government would actually have to give way to certain concessions with the states in order to maintain the union. So that's what I think is more likely. I think if you got enough states kind of working in cooperation with one another, you'd see a lot of cooperation, I think, between states in the Midwest, states in the South. You might see the other problem that states that might not like this have is that they're kind of isolated from one another. All right, you got Washington, California, and Oregon on one coast, and then you've got New England on the other coast. Well, that's difficult. This isn't a north-south comparison anymore.
No,
where
it won't
all the
be
countries,
geographic.
Yeah, all the countries, north of the Mason-Dixon line for the most part have good inner lines of communication and supply and whatnot. You wouldn't see that. It would be kind of the New England coast versus or New England coast and the West Coast are more ideologically aligned than the rest of the country. Well, when you have contiguous borders, it makes cooperation, collaboration, trade, all of that far more easy than if you have to cross that in order to coordinate activity, economic, military, or whatever else it is. So I think more likely what you would see is the federal government and other states recognizing that, hey, we just don't have the capacity to wrangle all of these people under our will. And so maybe what we should do is actually go back to understanding that, hey, there are certain jurisdictions of the federal government. We need to stay within those. My question would be is what do the states get as concession? And I would say that what states would really need to focus on as part of their concession in order to keep everything intact would be, hey, 16th Amendment either is revoked or it doesn't work the same way it did before. There would have to be kind of a new appreciation for the 9th and 10th Amendments to the Constitution. And I think there would have to be more of a rigorous crackdown on Article 1, Section 8 is your lane. You stay in it. And I think that would be...
That's why it seems like the income tax is where everything kind of went, well, one of the issues where we went wrong, because it causes it to be a situation where the federal government can extort the states for, basically refuse to. They get all this money. They refuse to.
I think you would see a massive transition. Once states started reasserting their authority over things that the federal government used the income tax, Social Security, and later on the Great Society programs to assert its authority over states. If all of a sudden they couldn't make good on those promises and the states were actually fulfilling a portion of that role, or what I would prefer, the marketplace was actually fulfilling that role, people wouldn't be living in a society where they just assumed the federal government did these things. And so it would drastically alter the way that people looked at their relationship with their federal government. That's my take anyway.
I don't think that you're going to get multiple countries. I mean, I said this earlier in the regular podcast that I keep thinking that you're going to get something more reminiscent of the Spanish Civil War. Yeah. And I know that Nick kind of cringes when he hears that because,
it was largely fascist versus communist.
I mean, I'll say this. I won't say it, but like there's one objectively good side in the Spanish Civil War there's one objectively evil side in the Spanish Civil War if you're on the right. And we all know what that side is. The side was not the nationalists.
I don't know that it would actually become two sides. I kind of feel like you would end up having everybody sort of draw their battle lines between their interests.
You didn't have two sides in the Spanish Civil War either.
Okay.
No.
But I'm also saying that I think we would probably end up with large swaths of sort of
partnerships.
Like that sounds businessy. I would almost say, like, how there's whole sections of other countries that are controlled by militia units or militia people. We would have that kind of situation. I think if it happens the way Christian says, where the dollar is no more, the money has collapsed, it's over. I don't think there is any cohesion at that point. All cohesion along state lines and things like that has dissolved, and now you just have the strongest people gaining power, and then you'll have militia groups in certain areas that control certain things.
But I don't think so. Again, I don't think that's what's going to happen in the United States, because I think one of the things that is so unique about the way the United States was initially organized was federalism. And while the federal government has done a lot to essentially circumvent or diminish some of the power of federalism, it still remains as a structure. And it's a structure that you can rally behind.
Yeah, but there's a lot of area where people can kind of join forces a bit and start creating their own. This is sort of like a state of Jefferson type things.
Well,
or not Jefferson.
State of Jones.
State of Jones.
Greater Idaho.
Where it's like, we're in this no man's land. Nobody owns us.
Look, let's be honest. There's still hollers in Appalachia. Mm-hmm. You don't just roll into because you happen to be the sheriff, right? You call ahead, right?
Yeah.
Because,
So, we didn't bring up in this episode.
We got to get to more questions, too.
I know.
So
we didn't bring up in this episode the possibility of a third way that, like, there's no guarantee that, even my scenario results in Civil War, revolution, or, well, maybe revolution, you could argue, but like Civil War, revolution, or national divorce, because I've brought this up to Nick before too, that like, I think something that's very high up on the likelihood list is you get a Caesar. And that's
the strong man.
Yeah. You get a red Caesar. And I don't mean red in the communist sense. I mean red in the Republican sense.
You mean like what's his face in Chile?
Pinochet?
Yeah, Pinochet.
Or Franco, but more that, like, remember all the stuff that the left was saying about Donald Trump, like when he came along, this guy's a fascist, dictator, like, and then Trump wasn't any of that stuff ultimately. But like, no, you could get somebody that actually is all this stuff that the left genuinely thinks that the right is.
Yeah.
And somebody like that can come along.
And if you got the right spun up hard enough, yeah.
Well, this is why, like, when hyperinflation hit in Germany, there was an attempt before the Nazis, 10 years before the Nazis, there was an attempt to overthrow the Weimar Republic called the Kapp Putsch. And it won for like 2 days. The army took over the government, And then, the socialists shut the whole country down because they just had trade unions, just go on strike. And then the whole thing fell apart because they literally couldn't have like the telegraphs work or the phones or the trains work. And so it fell apart because of that. But like that is an example of an attempted political strongman on the right attempting to take power because of a massive economic crisis. And it only failed because trade unions shut the country down.
Unions.
And we don't have unions running this country. Thank God.
Let's make that. So Ben Dillon asked.
Well, I need to go over to Rumble right quick. We've got to keep our people happy over there. And remember that if we don't finish by 3, Christian won't be able to order off the lunch menu at the Mexican restaurant. He said we had to end by 3. Okay. Roya on Rumble asks about the locust and refuge. Is there a way to actually differentiate them from the get-go, or do we need time to see who's who when they immigrate?
I think it's usually pretty obvious.
They're pretty obvious.
It's usually pretty obvious when people. So again, Tina and I originally,
they're the ones bringing soy dogs to your barbecue.
Do they even come to the barbecue?
Yeah, if they say anything about kale, right? No, I think. So Tina and I came from California. It doesn't mean that we don't like
Northern
California, Chico, California. It doesn't mean that we don't love and appreciate, things about where we grew up, and California is a beautiful state, but it's being destroyed. Mm-hmm. And we recognize that. And so when I went into the service and we were looking about where we were going to move, I missed my family, but I didn't want to end up in California because of what I saw happening. I wanted to move to Virginia because Virginia had a lot of the things that I just loved about it from a historical standpoint, from a geographical standpoint. And now I will say a lot of things have changed in Virginia since I've been here. But when I moved to Virginia, it's because I loved what it had to offer and I wanted to be a part of it. So I was thankful that I was moving to a place that was not imposing the sort of things that California was. And I think people could see that relatively quickly when we got here and we were interacting with people and we were talking to people in a church and whatnot. I think there's other people that you can, because we had it happen to us. Where we lived in Northern California used to be very, kind of more small town, rural, agricultural. And then there was a housing boom in San Francisco and a bunch of people sold their 2-bedroom homes for $1 million, moved up to Northern California to get away from the rat race in San Francisco. And then they wanted to join the school board and the board of supervisors and the town council, and they wanted to join the civic organizations. And all of a sudden they were bringing this entire culture that, like, if you loved it so much, why'd you leave? And so that's what I would say is I think you learn relatively quickly whether or not somebody appreciates what they left and where they're coming. If they're constantly talking about where they came from as if that's the model, why'd you leave?
Yeah.
Why'd you leave? If you're constantly talking about how much you appreciate the place that you're currently in and you give some indication of understanding why it is that way, that's a much better indication of that they appreciate where they've come.
One more question from Rumble. Onage says, have you considered a 30-second intro stinger? Would give me time to grab my headphones. Yes, I have. I'm hoping to put down a 30-second timer on the intro slide with some music so that people know when we're going to get started. So yes, working on that. Okay. Nick, you want to go back to your channel?
Yeah, let's go. Not my channel. We're just going over. Okay, Ben Morrison. Let me see. Does the smaller states like West Virginia that used to vote blue wholeheartedly switching to voting diehard red for the elections classify as a national divorce? Not for the purposes of what we're talking here. We're talking about national divorce in the sense that we're like states actually leaving or having some sort of like major departure from the current constitutional norm. So a state simply, changing the way it votes based off of, either changes within the respective parties or the population, it wouldn't be the same as national divorce, at least in the way we mean it here. All right, Bandit 848. If California, Oregon, and Washington broke off from the U.S., how would they handle losing access to the Pacific Ocean?
How would we handle?
Oh, it says how they, but maybe it's how we.
I think it's how
they obviously wouldn't lose it. They'd have it. How would we handle it? Well, I think there would be two ways that we look at it. Like, one would be, would it be within California, or would it be within California, Oregon, and Washington's best interest to allow markets to still get to their ports? And I think the answer is yes. So,
I think we will arm up and we will go on conquest and take over California, boot everybody else off to like somewhere else.
Tina's going full
Tina's
dictator.
going to be the strong man, apparently.
Yeah, Tina's going full dictator. No, I mean,
Caesar.
the thing is that what I think what we all need to understand is that we have to look at things from the level of what is in people's economic best interest. One of the reasons why California's economy is so strong, that's not because all of that wealth is just ultimately generated within California. It's because a lot of things have to move to California in order to load onto ports in San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco. They don't want to drastically decrease the amount of exports that can leave from California simply because it didn't come from California. And so they would still have a positive economic incentive to allow trade to go through their borders. It would just probably be set up, they would probably have some degree of tariffs or other excise taxes or whatnot. And so that would allow them to economically benefit, but they'd still probably allow trade to move through. All right, Nick, what are your thoughts on guys like Vivek and RFK? I see a lot of parallels in their overarching beliefs and values and the want to bring the country back together. Does this appeal to you? Actually, I'd love to sit down and talk to Vivek and RFK. I think both of them are very interesting. I will say this. I think RFK is modeled a lot more after what we would have considered probably what we would refer to as blue dog Democrats back in the day. That doesn't mean that RFK and I agree on a lot of things economically. He is far more comfortable with more government control over economic development, over things like healthcare than I would be. But I do think he falls more into that kind of JFK era Democrat where even though there'd be major different disagreements, even though he's not someone that I could ever see voting for, if he were in power, he's someone that, right now we talk about what they call the loyal opposition, which is to say someone that you may disagree with politically, but they still share enough, they still share enough characteristics with respect to what the country is, what the government should be doing, what it shouldn't be doing, processes in place to where you can work with that person on some things, and then you oppose on other things. And RFK seems to me, I could be wrong, seems to be a lot more in that vein of Democrat. For Vivek, Vivek is really interesting. I think one of the things I don't think he's going to be president, but I do think that
he's running for vice president.
Well, I think what he does is he actually is able to talk about these things, I think, to a broader audience than, like, say, Trump would be able to right now. There's people that when Trump gets on and talks about this, shut him off immediately. I think there's other people that are willing to listen to Vivek, and I'm probably butchering his name.
I'm pretty sure it's Vivek.
Vivek. That might not be willing to listen to other people. And a lot of the things that Vivek is talking about, there was another question earlier about Vivek wanting to jumpstart the economy by significantly reducing the size of the bureaucratic state and the federal government. I think it's an excellent idea. Most people think that because the federal government starts up a program to foster small business, then that must mean that more small businesses are getting off the ground and starting. No, in many cases, it's just the opposite, because now what you've created is another federal barrier to entry, right? You've created just one more institution or organization that I have to potentially work through in order to get preferential treatment. And so I do think Vivek's got a lot of really, really interesting ideas, and he's worth listening to.
He's the most intelligent guy running.
But I don't know that he would be my first choice, but yeah. Okay, and interrupt me if we got ones. Otherwise, I'm just keep going through this. Janice Bunn. So I'm just going to ask, maybe somebody has already, when are you going to run for president? We would really, yeah, probably. I don't see me ever doing that, Janice. I appreciate that. I always think it's meant as a compliment, or you just really hate me and want to, for me to ruin my life running for president. But I'm going to assume you mean it as a nice thing. Yeah, probably not something I would ever do.
I love this question from Mountain Lady. Do you guys think the reaction to Trump's potential arrest will get the same response as aliens did? You mean everybody's going to call it a psyop? Sorry. Just a little bit salty there.
Yeah. Christian is very mad. Sean McCartney.
He hates that reality.
I have my first daughter on the way. She has 2 older brothers, which I'm grateful for. Any advice you haven't already given for expecting my first baby girl? Thank you. Yeah, Sean. We've done a couple of videos on this. We did one on 3 things I learned raising daughters, where I talk about the two of the people that I had conversations with. Was one, obviously, my wife, about what I needed to do to be a good daddy. And then the other was a guy I known in the military that was, again, one of the biggest man whores I'd ever met in my life. And my question for him was, how do I protect my daughter from someone like you? And we kind of go a little bit more in depth on that. And I think
You said any advice you haven't already given.
Well, I think we're gonna actually do some more videos on this specifically. But one of the biggest things that I always stress to people for fathers with raising their little girls is the time you spend with them early on is really, really important. I think it's sometimes easy for men to get caught up in this idea, especially if you kind of assume those traditional roles of I'm the provider, I'm the protector. And obviously we provide and protect because we love, but that can kind of seem cold and distant. And so taking the time, you will be shocked at the little things that you do in your children's life and specifically in your daughter's life that they remember. Something that you will think was as mundane as having a little tea party and wearing the little tiara with her and stuff like that you thought there's no way she's going to remember this when she's older. You will be surprised. You will be surprised. And if you want the sort of relationship when she's 10, 11, 12, and especially when she's 14, 15, 16, that starts when they're 3, 4, and 5. I can't emphasize that enough. It starts at 3, 4, and 5. You are establishing levels of trust and love and affection and tenderness that she's going to remember. And as it gets older, she will see you as someone that she can trust and go to. Now, that's going to require different things throughout her life, but in those early stages, be present, do the little silly things, because they will remember it. Each one of my daughters has a little nickname. My oldest daughter, I always say sweetheart, or I call her Lilykins or whatever. My youngest daughter is Sweet Pea, and she knows she's Sweet Pea. It was funny. One time, one of the girls asked me a question. I couldn't tell who it was. And so I said, what was that, Sweet Pea? And Allie comes like flying out going, excuse me, I am Sweet Pea. So never underestimate the little things that you can do like that have a huge impact in establishing love and trust, because, man, it is going to pay dividends later when you are dealing with boys and friends and things that are far more complex than the tea party.
But Nick, the New York Times says that you shouldn't play with your kids.
That's if you wanted to ruin your kids, you could do that. All right, let me see. Wilhelm, is the Trump indictment left attempt to keep him from running in 2024? Yeah, I think for most of the left, that's what this is. I think for some people, they honestly want to see the perp walk. They want to see him. They want to see him in an orange jumpsuit and in jail so bad
they don't want to keep him
taste it.
from running. They want him to be the nominee because they're convinced that he's the easiest candidate.
I think that is true of half of them. I think that is not true of the other half.
I kind of think they want to use him as an example much like putting heads on pikes, right? Use him as an example to the rest of us to be like, don't cross us. And I just feel like it's not going to have the effect they wanted it to have.
I think there's some truth to that. I think that some people see this as a way of they see Trump as the personification of the worst insurrection since the Civil War, and they want to send a message that you will not be tolerated, and we'll show you. I
think they see Trump as what happens when our side decides it's not going to be walked on anymore, and they want to put us back in our place and be like, we will walk on you if we feel like it. We will tread on you. Yeah. And I think that's what they want. They want to send that message and get people to cower back down. And I just think it's going to do the opposite.
Yeah. Jim Ross, I want to thank you for the super chat. He goes, experts are influencing the bureaucratic and political elites, and not just one state or country, but many wealthy political protected groups exist in a different reality from the realities they impose on those they govern. I think that's especially true. And I will tell you this, I think it's been especially true, and this sounds a little weird, but since we went off the gold standard, this is one area where if you understand how to manipulate an inflationary economy, you can actually benefit pretty significantly from it. The thing is that most people don't. Most people rely on a very, very stable currency. Other people love when the Federal Reserve is just printing out and throwing dollars around. And I think it's actually created, again, I am not anti-wealth at all. Like I get so tired of people pretending like because someone's a billionaire, they're poorer. When in reality, if someone does a really good job in a market economy, they get to be a billionaire because they've done the best job using scarce resources in order to provide the products and services that people voluntarily chose to purchase. But we do see a situation where you see this connection between government and certain people within within industry that get themselves special protections. And that I think is one of the most obvious protected classes we have. And the problem is not capitalism. The problem is not free markets. The problem is cronyism.
The problem is QE.
And quantitative easing. Now, on the other side, I think with bureaucrats in general, I think there's a lot of people that find themselves in a situation where Thomas Sowell did the best job explaining this of anyone I've ever seen. He goes, you have to stop looking at government bureaucracies or agencies as if the only reason they exist is for their stated reason, right? Oh, the DOJ is to, provide justice, right? And housing and urban development is to help with housing and urban development. He goes, no, each of these institutions have their own motivations and incentives. And their number one motivation incentive is to increase their budget and increase their power. And that doesn't always make them conducive to solving the problem that they were organized to create in the first place. And so the more federal bureaucracy that you have, the more any state bureaucracy that you have doing that, the more problems that you have and the more rent seeking that you're going to have from both the private sector and the public sector. So no, I agree. It has become a huge, huge problem. All right. David Harley asks, what percentage of states do you think would push back against the federal government? I feel like most smaller states who may want, we asked this one, I thought.
My bad.
But the answer is I actually, depending on how bad it got, I think you would see, and you see it a little bit. Let me show you two ways that you see states pushing back against the federal government. One way you might like, one way you might not. States push back, blue states push back against the federal government on marijuana, right? They legalize it. It's still illegal federally, but they legalize it within their respective states. Here's another way that you've seen states kind of pushing back against the federal the government. Florida, Arizona, Texas, taking people that cross the border illegally and shipping them to sanctuary cities, which, by the way, I thought was overall a brilliant move, because what it did is it forced sanctuary cities to live with the consequences of their policies instead of just shifting it off to other people. And now all of a sudden they're realizing that they're at a crisis point and they haven't even begun to deal with some of the problems that the states that they've forever stuck their nose up at have. And so I do think you're going to see more and more states pushing back in sometimes subtle ways, sometimes a little bit more overt, but I do think you're going to see more of it.
Nick, let's get three more in if that's okay.
All right. Are you picking or are you just telling me three more?
No, okay. I got one right here for you.
Try to be concise.
She doesn't like my answers. Steve James,
they're just long.
What do you think about the idea that national divorce is a left-wing psyop, that any attempt to separate will cause the federal government to become more authoritarian, institute martial law, and crush us?
That's a really good point.
Look, I think that I do think we've already seen instances where the federal government is through federal law enforcement agencies have encouraged some of these like really just kind of crazy far out there groups to engage in activities. Like I want to say the whole kidnapping of the governor in Michigan.
That was like literally the federal. The Alphabet Boys were the ones who basically planned this to entrap these people. Yeah. And then they took them to trial and they failed. Yeah. And then they retried them and then got them convicted. So honestly, in my opinion, and it's controversial to say it, but like in my opinion, that was a total miscarriage of justice, I feel like, where the federal government entrapped people. It
is one thing. It is one thing for a federal agent to infiltrate a group in order to report on what they are doing. It is another thing for the federal agent to essentially be instructing and providing guidance to the group. I mean, that's a little bit,
it's so immoral for the federal government to radicalize people and then entrap them in something and then arrest them and prosecute them when they're the ones who did the radicalization in the planning of this fake plot thing. So actually I think it's a very legitimate point that, and by the way, this is something that Woodefelt has brought up in his right-wing backlash video when he was like, my message to the right is don't try to...
don't go crazy.
Don't go crazy. And I brought up when we did that episode that they don't need to go crazy. The right does not need to storm the Capitol January 6th style. They need to wait for the debt crisis to hit. And then there'll be a vacancy a power vacuum that they can fill.
Well, look, the bottom line is what I want is for my country to be successful and peaceful and the whole deal. I don't want there to be one side that's what I want. I want my country to be successful.
I want to win.
Okay. Obviously, I think winning is necessary to be successful, Christian. What I'm saying is that nothing that we're talking about should be encouraging people like, oh, this is why you need to come up with your own little militia group and do it.
I'm not saying go start a militia group, but
that's not what we're talking about. But what I am saying is that, you should be cognizant of the fact that is it in the best interest of a particular agent to try to foment, something that they know they can easily crush? That's been done throughout history. And so it wouldn't be inappropriate to be skeptical of it right now.
Here's a really good question.
All right. So if what Christian is suggesting happens, like for, again, the economic collapse, wouldn't we be completely open to foreign invasion if the dollar totally collapsed? Won't China attack? Do you want to answer this first? I'll tell you what my opinion is.
Because the rest of the world has a
do it
way worse, outlook of the future than we do. We've got a rough 10, 20 years ahead of us. China has even worse problems coming down the road. Like honestly, they might attack Taiwan to distract from it, but they're never going to attack the United States.
Well,
because
if they did, they would unify us. They would cause us to have a unifying element.
Let's just say this right now. I know a little something.
My take though is the rest of the world, we're actually in a better, as much as we have huge problems ahead of us, we're actually in a better position than Europe and China is.
But
and
would
especially
we be
Russia.
after that collapse? That's
yes,
the question.
because they're going to go through the same collapse. Okay. China's in worse economic position than we are right now, believe it or not. The other thing too is shipping a military across the Pacific Ocean to invade the United States is a logistical nightmare for which China does not possess the military capability. They just don't. We did a whole episode once on why China would have a horrible time trying to conquer Taiwan, even without major U.S. intervention, because trying to do an amphibious invasion 100 miles away. Think about it. When the United States invaded in World War II, when we invaded the continent, we didn't ship everything over and then invade Normandy. We had to ship it to England, and then we crossed a 22-mile channel, right? Like you're going to cross 3,000 miles of open ocean? Like, no, that's just not it's not a thing. That's not.
Well, I just think that if anybody did try to come and attack us as a result of that, we would assemble ourselves so fast it would make your head spin. I mean, having a common enemy to go up against will unify a country real fast.
Yeah, I don't see that being a problem. Okay, let me see. Red and black S10. What countries would you advise? Like, I'm sorry, I'm gonna need more context for that question. Ben Morrison, does the smaller states like West Virginia that used to, we already answered this one. You need to scroll way down, brother. All right. Thoughts on the justice system being pointed at President Biden for treason and President Trump for his sedition? Commanders-in-Chief committing either by the UCMJ warrant or trial court martial. I don't. Here's the problem right now is I don't think I think people are getting a little bit tired out of all this stuff. I don't think there's going to be some sort of crazy thing that they go after. I mean, obviously the DOJ is currently going after Trump for both things. They've gone him for classified documents. I think they've gone at some campaign finance component. They've also gone on now with respect to January 6th. Commanders-in-Chief committing like using the UCMJ to try to go after a president is just I don't think that's going to be a thing. All right, I think we've gone through all the questions that I see at this point. So here's what I want to do. I think we've already done our wrap-up, so I'm not going to redo that. But what I would ask you to do is, again, if you've looked at this, if you think it's interesting, if you think that this is something to potentially be, considering, and most importantly, you've got the question of, like, what do we as individuals do about any of this? Because hopefully none of us want to see this actually happen. We would like to see our country essentially go back to, just being the sort of place where we appreciate the fact that we can have differences. And the only way that we're really going to be able to do that is if we don't have a federal or even state governments, for that matter, constantly intervening on what should be individual decisions, constantly mismanaging economic development, constantly mismanaging our currency, right? I think most of us want to live in a world where we can be happy, healthy, prosperous, and free without constantly having to look over our shoulder with who's going to be in charge of the government next, and how is that going to directly impact my personal life? How is it going to impact my kids' education? How is it going to impact my healthcare? How's it going to impact my business? Like, that's not the sort of place we want to live in. Most of the reasons why people immigrated to the United States throughout our history was not because there was some large benevolent federal government that was going to hand them goodies all the time. They came to the United States because they were going to be able to provide for themselves without some noble or bureaucrat or apparatchik coming in and confiscating what they had worked hard to create. And that is what is special and unique about the United States. It's not just the government or the political apparatus that we have. It's the fact that it really was rooted in this idea that individual liberty, free market economics, private property rights, that's what provided people and put them in the best position to be able to flourish, not only for the benefit of themselves, but for the benefit of their family and their country. country. And that's what we're trying to fight for. So next episode, we're going to talk about how we work more with like-minded people in order to achieve those things, in order to be able to provide a marketplace not only of idea, but also of commerce within the system that we currently have, in order to once again point people not just away from lies, but towards something that is true and good and noble. Once again, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for your questions. Consider joining our community chat. The link is in the description, and we will see you for a very encouraging and uplifting episode this Thursday.